In the Mirror by Valery Bryusov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, .org. In the Mirror by Valery Bryusov. I have loved mirrors from my very earliest years. As an infant, I wept and trembled as I looked into their transparently truthful depths. My favorite game as a child was to walk up and down the room or the garden, holding a mirror in front of me, gazing into its abyss, walking over the edge at every step, and breathless with giddiness and terror. Even as a girl, I began to put mirrors all over my room, large and small ones, true and slightly distorted ones, some precise, and others a little dull. I got into the habit of spending whole hours, whole days, in the midst of intercrossing worlds which ran one into the other, trembled, vanished, and then reappeared again. It became a singular passion of mine to give my body to these soundless distances, these echoless perspectives, these separate universes cutting across our own and existing, despite our consciousness, in the same place and at the same time with it. This protracted actuality, separated from us by the smooth surface of glass, drew me towards itself by a kind of intangible touch, dragged me forward, as to an abyss, a mystery. I was drawn towards the apparition which always rose up before me when I came near a mirror, and which strangely doubled my being. I strove to guess how this other woman was differentiated from myself, how it was possible that my right hand should be her left, and that all the fingers of this hand should change places, though certainly on one of them was my wedding ring. My thoughts were confused when I attempted to probe this enigma, to solve it. In this world, where everybody could be touched, where voices were heard, I lived actually. In that reflected world, which it was only possible to contemplate, was she, phantasmally. She was almost as myself, and yet not at all myself. She repeated all my movements, but not one of these movements exactly coincided with those I made. She, that other, knew something I could not divine. She held a secret eternally hidden from my understanding. But I noticed that each mirror had its own separate and special world. Put two mirrors in the very same place, one after the other, and there will arise two different universes. And in different mirrors there rose up before me different apparitions, all of them like me, but never exactly like one another. In my small hand mirror lived a naive little girl with clear eyes, reminding me of my early youth. In my circular boudoir mirror was hidden a woman who knew all the diverse sweetness of caresses, shameless, free, beautiful, daring. In the oblong mirrors of the wardrobe door there always appeared a stern figure, imperious, cold, inexorable. I knew still other doubles of myself. In my dressing glass, in my folding gold-framed triptych, in the hanging mirror in the oaken frame, in the little neck mirror, and in many other mirrors which I treasured. To all the beings hiding themselves in these mirrors, I gave the possibility and the pretext to develop. According to the strange conditions of their world, they must take the form of the person who stands before the glass, but under this borrowed exterior they preserve their own personal characteristics. There were some worlds of mirrors which I loved, others which I hated. In some of them I loved to walk up and down for whole hours, losing myself in their attractive expanse. Others I fled from. In my secret heart I did not love all my doubles. I knew that they were all hostile toward me, if only for the fact that they were forced to clothe themselves in my hated likeness. But some of these mirror women I pitied. I forgave their hate, and felt almost friendly to them. There were some whom I despised, and I loved to laugh at their powerless fury. There were some whom I mocked by my own independence and tortured by my power over them. There were others, on the other hand, of whom I was afraid, who were too strong for me and who dared in their turn to mock at me, to command me. I hastened to get rid of the mirrors where these women lived. I would not look in them. I hid them, gave them away, even broke some in pieces. But every time I destroyed a mirror, I wept for whole days after, conscious of the fact that I had broken to pieces a distinct universe, and reproachful faces stared at me from the broken fragments of the world I had destroyed. The mirror with which my fate was to become linked, I bought one autumn at a sale of some sort. It was a large pier glass, swinging on screws. I was struck by the unusual clarity of its reflection. The phantasmal actuality in it was changed by the slightest inclination of the glass, but it was independent and vital to the edges. When I examined this pier glass at the sale, the woman who reflected me in it looked me in the eyes with a kind of haughty challenge. I did not wish to give in to her, to show that she had frightened me, so I bought the glass and ordered it to be placed in my boudoir. As soon as I was alone in the room, I immediately went up to the new mirror and fixed my eyes upon my rival. But she did the same to me, and standing opposite one another, we began to transfix each other with our glance as if we had been snakes. In the pupils of her eyes was my reflection, in mine, hers. My heart sank, and my head swam from her intent gaze. But at length, by an effort of will, I tore my eyes away from those other eyes, tipped the mirror with my foot so that it began to swing, rocking the image of my rival pitifully to and fro, and went out of the room. From that hour our strife began. In the evening of the first day of our meeting, I did not dare to go near the new pier glass. I went to the theater with my husband, laughed exaggeratedly, and was apparently light-hearted. On the morrow, in the clear light of a September day, I went boldly into my boudoir alone, and designedly sat down directly in front of the mirror. At the same moment, she, the other woman, also came in at the door to meet me, crossed the room, and then she too sat down opposite me. Our eyes met. In hers I read hatred towards myself. In mine she read hatred towards her. Our second duel began, a duel of eyes, two unyielding glances, commanding, threatening, hypnotizing. Each of us strove to conquer the other's will, to break down her resistance, to force her to submit to another's desire. It would have been a painful scene for an onlooker to witness, two women sitting opposite each other without moving, joined together by the magnetic attraction of each other's gaze, and almost losing consciousness under the psychical strain. Suddenly someone called me. The infatuation vanished. I got up and left the room. After this, our duels were renewed every day. I realized that this adventuress had purposely forced herself into my home to destroy me and take my place in this world. But I had not sufficient strength to deny myself this struggle. In this rivalry, there was a kind of secret intoxication. The very possibility of defeat had hidden in it a sort of sweet seduction. Sometimes I forced myself for whole days to keep away from the pier glass. I occupied myself with business, with amusements, but in the depths of my soul was always hidden the memory of the rival who in patience and self-reliance awaited my return. I would go back to her, and she would step forth in front of me, more triumphantly than ever, piercing me with her victorious gaze, and fixing me in my place before her. My heart would stop beating, and I with a powerless fury would feel myself under the authority of this gaze. So the days and weeks went by. Our struggle continued, but the preponderance showed itself more and more definitely to be on the side of my rival. And suddenly one day I realized that my will was in subjection to her will, that she was already stronger than I. I was overcome with terror. My first impulse was to flee from my home and go to another town. But I saw at once that this would be useless. I should, all the same, be overcome by the attractive force of this hostile will and be obliged to return to this room, to this mirror. Then there came a second thought, to shatter the mirror, reduce my enemy to nothingness. But to conquer her by brutal strength would mean that I acknowledged her superiority over myself. This would be humiliating. I preferred to remain and continue the struggle to the end, even though I were threatened with defeat. Soon there could be no doubt that my rival would triumph. At every meeting there was concentrated in her gaze still greater and greater power over me. Little by little I lost the possibility of letting a day pass without once going to my mirror. She ordered me to spend several hours daily in front of her. She directed my will as a hypnotist directs the will of a sleepwalker. She arranged my life, as a mistress arranges the life of a slave. I began to fulfill her demands. I became an automaton to her wordless orders. I knew that deliberately, cautiously, she would lead me by an unavoidable path to destruction, and I already made no resistance. I divined her secret plan, to cast me into the mirror world, and to come forth herself into our world, but I had no strength to hinder her. My husband and my relatives, seeing me spend whole hours, whole days and nights in front of my mirror, thought me demented and wanted to cure me, but I dared not reveal the truth to them. I was forbidden to tell them all the dreadful truth, all the horror towards which I was moving. One of the December days before the holidays turned out to be the day of my destruction. I remember everything clearly, precisely, circumstantially. Nothing in my remembrance is confused. As usual, I went into my boudoir early, at the first beginnings of the winter dawn twilight. I placed a comfortable armchair without a back in front of the mirror, sat down, and gave myself up to her. Without any delay, she appeared in answer to my summons. She too placed an armchair for herself. She too sat down and began to gaze at me. A dark foreboding oppressed my soul, but I was powerless to turn my face away, and I was forced to take to myself the insolent gaze of my rival. The hours went by, the shadows began to fall. Neither of us lighted a lamp. The glass of the mirror glimmered faintly in the darkness. The reflections had become scarcely visible, but the self-reliant eyes gazed with their former strength. I felt neither terror nor ill will, as on other days, but simply an intolerable anguish and a bitter consciousness that I was in the power of another. Time swam away, and on its tide I also swam into infinity, into a black expanse of powerlessness and lack of will. Suddenly she, that other, the reflected woman, got up from her chair. I trembled all over at this insult, but something invincible, something forcing me from within, compelled me also to stand up. The woman in the mirror took a step forward. I did the same. The woman in the mirror stretched forth her arms. I did so too. Looking straight at me with hypnotizing and commanding eyes, she moved forward, and I advanced to meet her. And it was strange. With all the horror of my position, with all my hate towards my rival, there fluttered somewhere in the depths of my soul a painful consolation, a secret joy, to enter at last into that mysterious world into which I had gazed from my childhood, and which up till now had remained inaccessible to me. At moments I hardly knew which of us was drawing the other towards herself, she me or I her, whether she was eager to occupy my place, or whether I had devised all this struggle in order to displace her. But when, moving forward, my hands touched hers on the glass, I turned quite pale with repugnance, and she took my hand by force and drew me still nearer to herself. My hands were plunged into the mirror as into burning icy water. The cold of the glass penetrated into my body with a horrible pain, as if all the atoms of my being had changed their mutual relationship. In another moment my face had touched the face of my rival. I saw her eyes right in front of my own. I was transfused into her with a monstrous kiss. Everything vanished from me in a torment of suffering unlike any other, and when I came to my senses after the swoon, I still saw in front of me my own boudoir on which I gazed from out of the mirror. My rival stood before me and burst into laughter. And I, oh, the cruelty of it! I who was dying with humiliation and torture was obliged to laugh too, to repeat all her grimaces in a triumphant, joyful laugh. I had not yet succeeded in considering my position when my rival suddenly turned round, walked towards the door, vanished from my sight, and I at once fell into torpor, into non-existence. Then my life as a reflection began. It was a strange, half-conscious, but mysteriously sweet life. There were many of us in this mirror, dark in soul and slumbering of consciousness. We could not speak to one another, but we felt each other's proximity and loved one another. We could see nothing. We heard nothing clearly. And our existence was like the enfeeblement that comes from being unable to breathe. Only when a being from the world of men approached the mirror, we, suddenly taking up his form, could look forth into the world, could distinguish voices, and breathe a full breath. I think that the life of the dead is like that, a dim consciousness of one's ego, a confused memory of the past, and an oppressive desire to be incarnated anew, even if only for a moment, to see, to hear, to speak. And each of us cherished and concealed a secret dream, to free one's self, to find for oneself a new body, to go out into the world of constancy and steadfastness. During the first days, I felt myself absolutely unhappy in my new position. I still knew nothing, understood nothing. I took the form of my rival submissively and unthinkingly when she came near the mirror and began to jeer at me. and she did this fairly often. It afforded her great delight to flaunt her vitality before me, her reality. She would sit down and force me also to sit down, stand up and exult as she saw me stand, wave her arms about, dance, force me to repeat her movements, and burst out laughing and continue to laugh so that I should have to laugh too. She would shriek insulting words in my face, and I could make no answer to them. She would threaten me with her fist and mock at my forced repetition of the gesture. She would turn her back on me, and I, losing sight, losing features, would become conscious of the shame of the half-existence left to me. And then suddenly, with one blow, she would whirl the mirror round on its axle and with the oscillation throw me completely into nonentity. Little by little, however, the insults and humiliations awoke a consciousness in me. I realized that my rival was now living my life, wearing my dresses, being considered as my husband's wife, and occupying my place in the world. Then there grew up in my soul a feeling of hate and a thirst for vengeance, like two fiery flowers. I began bitterly to curse myself for having, by my weakness or my criminal curiosity, allowed her to conquer me. I arrived at the conviction that this adventuress would never have triumphed over me if I myself had not aided her in her wiles. And so, as I became more familiar with some of the conditions of my new existence, I resolved to continue with her the same fight which she had carried on with me. If she, a shadow, could occupy the place of a real woman, was it possible that I, a human being, and only temporarily a shadow, should not be stronger than a phantom? I began from a very long way off. At first I pretended that the mockery of my rival tormented me quite unbearably. I purposely afforded her all the satisfaction of victory. I provoked in her the secret instinct of the executioner throwing himself upon his helpless victim. She gave herself up to this bait. She was attracted by this game with me. She put forth the wings of her imagination and thought out new trials for me. She invented thousands of wiles to show me over and over again that I was only a reflection, that I had no life of my own. Sometimes she played on the piano in front of me, torturing me by the soundlessness of my world. Sometimes, seated before the mirror, she would drink in tiny sips my favorite liqueurs, compelling me only to pretend that I also was drinking them. Sometimes, at length, she would bring into my boudoir people whom I hated, and before my face she would allow them to kiss her body, letting them think that they were kissing me. And afterwards, when we were alone, she would burst into a malicious and triumphant laugh. But this laugh did not wound me at all. There was sweetness in its keenness, my expectation of revenge. Unnoticeably, in the hours of her insults to me, I would accustom my rival to look me in the eyes, and I would gradually overpower her gaze. Soon at my will, I could already force her to raise and lower her eyelids, and make this and that movement of the face. I had already begun to triumph, though I hid my feeling under a mask of suffering. Strength of soul grew up within me, and I began to dare to lay commands upon my enemy. Today you shall do so and so, today you shall go to such and such a place, tomorrow you shall come to me at such a time. And she would fulfill them. I entangled her soul in the nets of my desires, woven together with a strong thread in which I held her soul, and I secretly rejoiced when I noticed my success. When one day, in the hour of her laughter, she suddenly caught on my lips a victorious smile which I was unable to hide, it was already too late. She rushed out of the room in a fury, but as I fell into the sleep of my nonentity, I knew that she would return, knew that she would submit to me. And a rapture of victory gushed out over my involuntary lack of strength, piercing with a rainbow shaft of light the gloom of my seeming death. She did return. She came up to me in anger and terror, shrieked to me, threatened me. But I was commanding her to do it, and she was obliged to submit. Then began the game of a cat with a mouse. At any time I could have cast her back into the depths of the glass and come forth myself again into sounding and hard actuality. But I delayed to do this. It was sweet to me to indulge in non-existence sometimes. It was sweet to me to intoxicate myself with the possibility. At last, this is strange, is it not? There suddenly was aroused in me a pity for my rival, for my enemy, for my executioner. Everything in her was something of my own, and it was dreadful for me to drag her forth from the realities of life and to turn her into a phantom. I hesitated and dare not do it. I put it off from day to day. I did not know myself what I wanted and what I dreaded. And suddenly, on a clear spring day, men came into the boudoir with planks and axes. There was no life in me. I lay in the voluptuousness of torpor, but without seeing them I knew they were there. The men began to busy themselves near the mirror which was my universe, and one after another the souls who lived in it with me were awakened and took transparent flesh in the form of reflections. A dreadful uneasiness agitated my slumbering soul. With a presentiment of horror, a presentiment even of irretrievable ruin, I gathered together all the might of my will. What efforts it cost me to struggle against the lassitude of half-existence. So living people sometimes struggle with a nightmare, tearing themselves from its suffocating bands towards actuality. I concentrated all the force of my suggestion into a summons, directed towards her, towards my rival. Come hither. I hypnotized her, magnetized her with all the tension of my half-slumbering will. There was little time. The mirror had already begun to swing. They were already preparing to nail it up in a wooden coffin, to take it away, whither I knew not. And with an almost mortal effort I called again and again, "Come!" And I suddenly began to feel that I was coming to life. She, my enemy, opened the door, and came to meet me, pale, half-dead, in answer to my call, with faltering steps as men go to punishment. I fastened my eyes on hers, bound up my gaze with hers, and when I had done this, I knew already that I had gained the victory. I at once compelled her to send the men out of the room. She submitted, without even making an attempt to oppose me. We were alone together once more. To delay was no longer possible, and I could not bring myself to forgive her craftiness. In her place, in my time, I should have acted otherwise. Now I ordered her, without pity, to come to meet me. A moan of torture opened her lips. Her eyes widened as before a phantom. But she came, trembling, falling. She came. I also went forward to meet her, lips curving triumphantly, eyes wide open with joy, swaying in an intoxicating rapture. Again our hands touched each other's. Again our lips came near together, and we fell each into the other, burning with the indescribable pain of bodily exchange. In another moment I was already in front of the mirror. My breast filled itself with air. I cried out loudly and victoriously and fell just here, in front of the pier glass, prone from exhaustion. My husband and the servants ran towards me. I could only tell them to fulfill my previous orders and take the mirror away, out of the house, at once. That was wisely thought, wasn't it? You see, she, that other, might have profited by my weakness in the first minutes of my return to life, and by a desperate assault might have tried to wrest the victory from my hands. Sending the mirror out of the house, I could ensure my own quietude for a long time, as long as I liked, and my rival had earned such a punishment for her cunning. I defeated her with her own tools, with the blade which she herself had raised against me. After having given this order, I lost consciousness. They laid me on my bed. A doctor was called in. I was treated as suffering from a nervous fever. For a long while my relatives had thought me ill, and not normal. In the first outburst of exultation, I told them all that had happened to me. My stories only increased their suspicions. They sent me to a home for the mentally afflicted, and I am there now. All my being, I agree, is profoundly shaken. But I do not want to stay here. I am eager to return to the joys of life, to all the countless pleasures which are accessible to a living human being. I have been deprived of them too long. Besides, shall I say it? There is one thing which I am bound to do as soon as possible. I ought to have no doubt that I am this I. But all the same, whenever I begin to think of her who is imprisoned in my mirror, I begin to be seized by a strange hesitation. What if the real I is there? Then I myself who think this, I who write this, I am a shadow. I am a phantom. I am a reflection. In me are only the poured forth remembrances, thoughts and feelings of that other, the real person. And, in reality, I am thrown into the depths of the mirror in non-entity. I am pining, exhausted, dying. I almost know that this is not true. But in order to disperse the last clouds of doubt, I ought again once more, for the last time, to see that mirror. I must look into it once more to be convinced that there is the impostor, my enemy, she who played my part for some months. I shall see this, and all the confusion of my soul will pass away, and I shall again be free from care, bright, happy. Where is this mirror? Where shall I find it? I must once more look into its depths. End of In the Mirror. Recording by Scarecrow.
From the Loom of the Dead by Elia Wilkinson Peedy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Loom of the Dead. When Orda Bjarnason tells a tale, all the men stop their talking to listen, for they know her to be wise with the wisdom of the old people, and that she has more learning than can be got even from the great schools of Reykjavik. She is especially prized by them here in this new country, where the Iceland men are settled, this America, so new in letters, where the people speak foolishly and write unthinking books. So the men who know that it is given to the mothers of earth to be very wise stop their six-part singing or their jangles about the free thinkers and give attentive ear when Urda Bjarnason lights her pipe and begins her tale. She is very old. Her daughters and sons are all dead, but her granddaughter, who is most respectable and the cousin of a physician, says that Urda is 24 and 100, and there are others who say that she is older still. She watches all that the Iceland people do in the new land. She knows about the building of the 5 villages on the North Dakota plain, and of the founding of the churches and the schools, and the tilling of the wheat farms. She notes with suspicion the actions of the women who bring home webs of cloth from the store instead of spinning them as their mothers did before them. And she shakes her head at the wives who run to the village grocery store every fortnight, imitating the wasteful American women who throw butter in the fire faster than it can be turned from the churn. She watches yet other things. All winter long the white snows reach across the gently rolling plains as far as the eye can behold. In the morning she sees them tinted pink at the east. At noon she notes golden lights flashing across them. When the sky is gray, which is not often, she notes that they grow as ashen as a face with a death shadow on it. Sometimes they glitter with silver-like tips of ocean waves, but at these things she looks only casually. It is when the blue shadows dance on the snow that she leaves her corner behind the iron stove and stands before the window, resting her 2 hands on the stout bar of her cane and gazing out across the waste with eyes which age has restored after 4 decades of decrepitude. The young Iceland men say, "Mother, it is the clouds hurrying across the sky that makes the dance of the shadows." "There are no clouds," she replies, and points to the jewel-like blue of the arching sky. "It is the drifting air," explains Fredrik Haldursson, he who has been in the northern seas. "As the wind buffets the air, it looks blue against the white of the snow. 'Tis the air that makes the dancing shadows." But Urda shakes her head and points with her dried fingers, and those who stand beside her see figures moving, and airy shapes, and contortions of strange things, such as are seen in a beryl stone. "But Urda Bjarnason," says Ingeborg Christiansen, the pert young wife with the blue-eyed twins, "why is it we see these things only when we stand beside you and you help us to the sight?" "Because," says the mother with a steel-blue flash of her old eyes, "having eyes you will not see." Then the men laugh. They like to hear Ingeborg worsted, for did she not jilt 2 men from Gardar, and 1 from Mountain, and another from Winnipeg? Not even Ingeborg can deny that Mother Urda tells true things. "Today," says Urda, standing by the little window and watching the dance of the shadows, "a child breathed thrice on a farm at the west, and then it died." The next week at the church gathering, when all the sledges stopped at the house of Erda's granddaughter, they said it was so, that John Christensen's wife, Margaret, never heard the voice of her son, but that he breathed thrice in his nurse's arms and died. 3 sledges run over the snow toward Milton, says Erda. All are laden with wheat, and in one is a stranger. He has with him a strange engine, but its purpose I do not know. 6 hours later, the drivers of 3 empty sledges stop at the house. We have been to Milton with wheat, they say, and Christian Johnson here carried a photographer from St. Paul. Now it stands to reason that the farmers like to amuse themselves through the silent and white winters, and they prefer above all things to talk or to listen, as has been the fashion of their race for 1,000 years. Among all the storytellers there is none like Erda, for she is the daughter and the granddaughter and the great-granddaughter of storytellers. It is given to her to talk as it is given to John Thorlakson to sing, he who sings so as his sledge flies over the snow at night, that the people come out in the bitter air from their doors to listen, and the dogs put up their noses and howl, not liking music. In the little cabin of Peter Christensen, the husband of Erda's granddaughter, it sometimes happens that 20 men will gather about the stove. They hang their bearskin coats on the wall, put their fur gauntlets underneath the stove where they will keep warm, and then stretch their stout, felt-covered legs to the wood fire. The room is fetid. The coffee steams eternally on the stove, and from her chair in the warmest corner Erda speaks out to the listening men, who shake their heads with joy as they hear the pure old Icelandic flow in sweet rhythm from between her lips. Among the many tales she tells is that of the dead weaver, and she tells it in the simplest language in all the world, language so simple that even great scholars could find no simpler, and the children crawling on the floor can understand. John and Loa lived with their father and mother far to the north of the island of fire, and when the children looked from their windows they saw only wide scours and jagged lava rocks, and a distant deep gleam of the sea. They caught the shine of the sea through an eye-shaped opening in the rocks, and all the long night of winter it gleamed up at them like the eye of a dead witch. But when it sparkled and began to laugh, the children danced about the hut and sang, for they knew the bright summer time was at hand. Then their father fished, and their mother was gay, but it is true that even in the winter and the darkness they were happy, for they made fishing nets and baskets and cloth together, John and Loa and their father and mother, and the children were taught to read in the books, and were told the sagas, and given instruction in the part singing. They did not know there was such a thing as sorrow in the world, for no one had ever mentioned it to them. But one day their mother died. Then they had to learn how to keep the fire on the hearth, and to smoke the fish, and make the black coffee, and also they had to learn how to live when there is sorrow at the heart. They wept together at night for lack of their mother's kisses, and in the morning they were loath to rise because they could not see her face. The dead cold eye of the sea watching them from among the lava rocks made them afraid, so they hung a shawl over the window to keep it out, and the house, try as they would, did not look clean and cheerful as it had used to do when their mother sang and worked about it. One day, when a mist rested over the eye of the sea, like that which one beholds on the eyes of the blind, a great sorrow came to them, for a stepmother crossed the threshold. She looked at John and Loa, and made complaint to their father that they were still very small and not likely to be of much use. After that they had to rise earlier than ever, and to work as only those who have their growth should work, till their hearts cracked for weariness and shame. They had not much to eat, for their stepmother said she would trust to the gratitude of no other woman's child, and that she believed in laying up against old age. So she put the few coins that came to the house in a strong box, and bought little food. Neither did she buy the children clothes, though those which their dear mother had made for them were so worn that the warp stood apart from the woof, and there were holes at the elbows and little warmth to be found in them anywhere. Moreover, the quilts on their beds were too short for their growing length, so that at night either their purple feet or their thin shoulders were uncovered, and they wept for the cold, and in the morning, when they crept into the larger room to build a fire, they were so stiff they could not stand straight, and there was pain at their joints. The wife scolded all the time, and her brow was like a storm sweeping down from the northwest. There was no peace to be had in the house. The children might not repeat to each other the sagas their mother had taught them, nor try their pot singing, nor make little doll cradles of rushes. Always they had to work, always they were scolded, always their clothes grew thinner. Stepmother cried lower one day, she whom her mother had called the little bird, "We are cold because of our rags. Our mother would have woven blue cloth for us and made it into garments." "Your mother is where she will weave no cloth," said the stepmother, and she laughed many times. All in the cold and still of that night the stepmother wakened, and she knew not why. She sat up in her bed, and knew not why. She knew not why, and she looked into the room, and there by the light of a burning fish's tail, 'twas such a light the folk used in those days, was a woman weaving. She had no loom, and shuttle she had none. All with her hand she wove a wondrous cloth, stooping and bending, rising and swaying, with motions beautiful as those the northern lights make in a midwinter sky. She wove a cloth. The warp was blue and mystical to see. The woof was white, and shone with its whiteness, so that of all the webs the stepmother had ever seen, she had seen none like to this. Yet the sight delighted her not, for beyond the drifting web and beyond the weaver she saw the room and furniture, aye, saw them through the body of the weaver and the drifting of the cloth. Then she knew, as the haunted are made to know, that 'twas the mother of the children come to show her she could still weave cloth. The heart of the stepmother was cold as ice, yet she could not move to waken her husband at her side, for her hands were as fixed as if they were crossed on her dead breast. The voice in her was silent, and her tongue stood to the roof of her mouth. After a time the wraith of the dead mother moved toward her, the wraith of the weaver moved her way, and round and about her body was wound the shining cloth. Whenever it touched the body of the stepmother, it was as hateful to her as the touch of a monster out of sea slime, so that her flesh crept away from it, and her senses swooned. In the early morning she woke to the voices of the children, whispering in the inner room, as they dressed with half-frozen fingers. Still about her was the hateful, beautiful web, filling her soul with loathing and with fear. She thought she saw the task set for her, and when the children crept in to light the fire, very purple and thin were their little bodies, and the rags hung from them. She arose and held out the shining cloth, and cried, "Here is the web your mother wove for you. I will make it into garments." But even as she spoke, the cloth faded and fell into nothingness, and the children cried, "Stepmother, you have the fever." And then, "Stepmother, what makes the strange light in the room?" That day the stepmother was too weak to rise from her bed, and the children thought she must be going to die, for she did not scold as they cleared the house and braided their baskets, and she did not frown at them, but looked at them with wistful eyes. By fall of night she was as weary as if she had wept all the day, and so she slept. But again she was awakened and knew not why, and again she sat up in her bed and knew not why, and again, not knowing why, she looked and saw a woman weaving cloth. All that had happened the night before happened this night. Then when the morning came and the children crept in shivering from their beds, she arose and dressed herself, and from her strong box she took coins, and bade her husband go with her to the town. So that night a web of cloth, woven by one of the best weavers in all Iceland, was in the house, and on the beds of the children were blankets of lamb's wool, soft to the touch and fair to the eye. After that the children slept warm and were at peace, for now when they told their sagas their mother had taught them, or tried their pot songs as they sat together on their bench, the stepmother was silent, for she feared to chide, lest she should wake at night, not knowing why, and see the mother's wraith. End of From the Loom of the Dead by Elia Wilkinson Peattie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Man-Eating Tree by Phil Robinson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Preliminary note. Before committing this paper to the ridicule of the great mediocre, for many, I fear, will be inclined to regard this story as incredible, I would venture on the expression of an opinion regarding credulity, which I do not remember to have met before. It is this: placing supreme wisdom and supreme unwisdom at the two extremes, and myself in the exact mean between them, I am surprised to find that whether I travel towards the one extreme or the other, the credulity of those I meet increases. To put it as a paradox, whether a man be foolisher or wiser than I am, he is more credulous. I make this remark to point out to those of the great mediocre whose notice it may have escaped, that credulity is not of itself shameful or contemptible, and that it depends upon the manner rather than the matter of their belief, whether they gravitate towards the sage or the reverse way. According, therefore, to the incredibility found in the following, the reader may measure, as pleases him, his wisdom or his unwisdom. Z. Oriel. End of preliminary note. Peregrine Oriel, my maternal uncle, was a great traveller, as his prophetical sponsors at the font seemed to have guessed he would be. Indeed, he had rummaged in the garrets and cellars of the earth with something more than ordinary diligence. But in the narrative of his travels he did not, unfortunately, preserve the judicious caution of Xenophon between the thing seen and the thing heard. And thus it came about that the town councillors of Brunsbüttel, to whom he had shown a duck-billed platypus caught alive by him in Australia, and who had him posted for an importer of artificial vermin, were not alone in their skepticism of some of the old man's tales. Thus, for instance, who could hear and believe the tale of the man-sucking tree from which he had barely escaped with his life? He called it himself more terrible than the upas, this awful plant that rears its splendid death-shade in the central solitude of a Nubian fern forest, sickens by its unwholesome humors all vegetation from its immediate vicinity, and feeds upon the wild beasts that, in the terror of the chase or the heat of noon, seek the thick shelter of its boughs, upon the birds that, flitting across the open space, come within the charmed circle of its power, or innocently refresh themselves from the cups of its great waxen flowers, upon even man himself, when, an infrequent prey, the savage seeks its asylum in the storm, or turns from the harsh, foot-wounding sword-grass of the glade to pluck the wondrous fruit that hang plumb down among the wondrous foliage. And such fruit, glorious golden ovals, great honey drops, swelling by their own weight into pear-shaped translucencies. The foliage glistens with a strange dew that all day long drips on to the ground below, nurturing a rank growth of grasses, which shoot up in places so high that their spikes of fierce blood-fed green show far up among the deep-tinted foliage of the terrible tree, and, like a jealous bodyguard, keep concealed the fearful secret of the charnel house within, and draw round the black roots of the murderous plant a decent screen of living green. Such was his description of the plant, and the other day, looking up in a botanical dictionary, I find that there is really known to naturalists a family of carnivorous plants, but I see that they are most of them very small and prey upon little insects only. My maternal uncle, however, knew nothing of this, for he died before the days of the discovery of the sundew and pitcher plants, and grounding his knowledge of the man-sucking tree simply on his own terrible experience of it, explained its existence by theories of his own, denying the fixity of all the laws of nature except one, that the stronger shall endeavor to consume the weaker, and holding even this fixity to be itself only a means to a greater general changefulness, he argued that, since any partial distribution of the faculty of self-defense would presume an unworthy partiality in the Creator, and since the sensual instincts of beast and vegetable and manifestly analogous, the world must be as percipient as sentient throughout. Carrying on his theory, for it was something more than hypothesis with him, a stage or two further, he arrived at the belief that given the necessity of any imminent danger or urgent self-interest, every animal or vegetable could eventually revolutionize its nature, the wolf feeding on grass or nesting in trees, and the violet arming herself with thorns or entrapping insects. How, he would ask, can we claim for man the consequence of perceptions to sensations, and yet deny to beasts that hear, see, feel, smell, and taste a percipient principle coexistent with their senses? And if in the whole range of the animate world there is this gift of self-defense against extirpation and offense against weakness, why is the inanimate world, holding as fierce a struggle for existence as the other, to be left defenseless and unarmed? And I deny that it is. The Brazilian epiphyte strangles the tree and sucks out its juices. The tree, again, to starve off its vampire parasite, withdraws its juices into its roots, and piercing the ground in some new place, turns the current of its sap into other growths. The epiphyte then drops off the dead boughs onto the fresh green sprouts springing from the ground beneath it, and so the fight goes on. Again, look at the Indian peepul tree. In what does the fierce yearning of its roots towards the distant well differ from the sad struggling of the camel to the oasis, or of Sennacherib's army to the saving Nile? Is the sensitive plant unconscious? I have walked for miles through plains of it, and watched, till the watching almost made me afraid lest the plants should pluck up courage and turn upon me, the green carpet paling into silver gray before my feet, and fainting away all round me as I walked. So strangely did I feel the influence of this universal aversion, that I would have argued with the plant, but what was the use? If only I stretched out my hands, the mere shadow of the limb terrified the vegetable to sickness. Shrubs crumbled up at every commencement of my speech, and at my periods great sturdy-looking bushes, to whose robustness I had foolishly appealed, sank in pallid supplication. Not a leaf would keep me company. A breath went forth from me that sickened life. My mere presence paralyzed life, and I was glad at last to come out among a less timid vegetation, and to feel the resentful spear-grass retaliating on the heedlessness that would have crushed it. The vegetable world, however, has its revenges. You may keep the guinea pig in a hutch, but how will you pet the basilisk? The little sensitive plant in your garden amuses your children, who will find pleasure also in seeking cockchafers spin round on a pin. But how could you transplant a vegetable that seizes the running deer, strikes down the passing bird, and once taking hold of him, sucks the carcass of man himself, till his matter becomes as vague as his mind, and all his animate capabilities cannot snatch him from the terrible embrace of, God help him, an inanimate tree? "Many years ago," said my uncle, "I turned my restless steps toward Central Africa, and made the journey from where the Senegal empties itself into the Atlantic to the Nile, skirting the great desert and reaching Nubia on my way to the eastern coast. I had with me then 3 native attendants, 2 of them brothers, the third, Otona, a young savage from the Gaboon uplands, a mere lad in his teens. And one day, leaving my mule with the 2 men who were pitching my tent for the night, I went on with my gun, the boy accompanying me, towards a fern forest which I saw in the near distance. As I approached it, I found the forest was cut into 2 by a wide glade, and seeing a small herd of the common antelope, an excellent beast, in the pot, browsing their way along the shaded side, I crept after them. Though ignorant of their real danger, the herd was suspicious, and slowly trotting along before me, enticed me for a mile or more along the verge of the fern growths. Turning a corner, I suddenly became aware of a solitary tree growing in the middle of the glade, 1 tree alone. It struck me at once that I had never seen a tree exactly like it before, but being intent upon venison for my supper, I looked at it only long enough to satisfy my first surprise at seeing a single plant of such rich growth flourishing luxuriantly in a spot where only the harsh fern canes seemed to thrive. The deer, meanwhile, were midway between me and the tree, and looking at them I saw they were going to cross the glade. Exactly opposite them was an opening in the forest, in which I should certainly have lost my supper. So I fired into the middle of the family as they were filing before me. I hit a young fawn, and the rest of the herd, wheeling round in their sudden terror, made off in the direction of the tree, leaving the fawn struggling on the ground. Otona, the boy, ran forward at my order to secure it, but the little creature, seeing him coming, attempted to follow its comrades, and at a fair pace held on their course. The herd had meanwhile reached the tree, but suddenly, instead of passing under it, swerved in their career, and swept round it at some yards' distance. Was I mad, or did the plant really try to catch the deer? On a sudden I saw, or thought I saw, the tree violently agitated, and while the ferns all round were standing motionless in the dead evening air, its boughs were swayed by some sudden gust towards the herd, and swept in the force of their impulse almost to the ground. I drew my hand across my eyes, closed them for a moment, and looked again. The tree was as motionless as myself. Towards it, and now close to it, the boy was running in excited pursuit of the fawn. He stretched out his hands to catch it. It bounded from his eager grasp. Again he reached forward, and again it escaped him. There was another rush forward, and the next instant boy and deer were beneath the tree. And now there was no mistaking what I saw. The tree was convulsed with motion, leaned forward, swept its thick foliaged boughs to the ground, and enveloped from my sight the pursuer and the pursued. I was within 100 yards, and the cry of Otona from the midst of the tree came to me in all the clearness of its agony. There was then one stifled, strangling scream, and except for the agitation of the leaves where they had closed upon the boy, there was not a sign of life. I called out, "Otona!" No answer came. I tried to call out again, but my utterance was like that of some wild beast, smitten at once with sudden terror and its death wound. I stood there changed from all semblance of a human being. Not all the terrors of earth together could have made me take my eye from the awful plant, or my foot off the ground. I must have stood thus for at least an hour, for the shadows had crept out from the forest half across the glade before that hideous paroxysm of fear left me. My first impulse then was to creep stealthily away, lest the tree should perceive me, but my returning reason bade me approach it. The boy might have fallen into the lair of some beast of prey, or perhaps the terrible life in the tree was that of some great serpent among its branches. Preparing to defend myself, I approached the silent tree, the harsh grass crisping beneath my feet with a strange loudness, the cicadas in the forest shrilling till the air seemed throbbing round me with waves of sound. The terrible truth was soon before me in all its awful novelty. The vegetable first discovered my presence at about 50 yards distance. I then became aware of a stealthy motion among the thick-lipped leaves, reminding me of some wild beast slowly gathering itself up from long sleep, a vast coil of snakes in restless motion. Have you ever seen bees hanging from a bough, a great cluster of bodies, bee clinging to bee, and by striking the bough or agitating the air caused that massed life to begin sulkily to disintegrate, each insect asserting its individual right to move? And do you remember how, without one bee leaving the pensile cluster, the whole became gradually instinct with sullen life and horrid with a multitudinous motion? I came within 20 yards of it. The tree was quivering through every branch, muttering for blood, and, helpless, with rooted feet, yearning with every branch towards me. It was that terror of the deep sea, which the men of the northern fjords dread, and which, anchored upon some sunken rock, stretches into vain space its longing arms, pellucid as the sea itself, and as relentless, maimed Polypheme, groping for his victims. Each separate leaf was agitated and hungry. Like hands they fumbled together, their fleshy palms curling upon themselves and again unfolding, closing on each other and falling apart again. Thick, helpless, fingerless hands, rather lips or tongues than hands, dimpled closely with little cup-like hollows. I approached near and near, step by step, till I saw that these soft horrors were all of them in motion, opening and closing incessantly. I was now 10 yards of the farthest reaching bough. Every part of it was hysterical with excitement. The agitation of its members was awful, sickening yet fascinating. In an ecstasy of eagerness for the food so near them, the leaves turned upon each other. Two meeting would suck together face to face with a force that compressed their joint thickness to a half, thinning the two leaves into one, now grappling in a volute like a double shell, writhing like some green worm, and at last, faint with the violence of the paroxysm, would slowly separate, falling apart as leeches gorged drop off the limbs. A sticky dew glistened in the dimples, welled over, and trickled down the leaf. The sound of it dripping from leaf to leaf made it seem as if the tree was muttering to itself. The beautiful golden fruit, as they swung here and there, were clutched now by one leaf and now by another, held for a moment close, enfolded from the sight, and then as suddenly released. Here a large leaf, vampire-like, had sucked out the juices of a smaller one. It hung limp and bloodless, like a carcass of which the weasel has tired. I watched the terrible struggle, till my starting eyes, strained by intense attention, refused their office, and I can hardly say what I saw, but the tree before me seemed to have become a live beast. Above me I felt conscious was a great limb, and each of its 1,000 clammy hands reached downwards towards me, fumbling. It strained, shivered, rocked, and heaved. It flung itself about in despair. The boughs, tantalized to madness with the presence of flesh, were tossed to this side and to that, in the agony of a frantic desire. The leaves were wrung together as the hands of one driven to madness by sudden misery. I felt the vile dew spurting from the tense veins fall upon me. My clothes began to give out a strange odor. The ground I stood on glistened with animal juices. Was I bewildered by terror? Had my senses abandoned me in my need? I know not, but the tree seemed to me to be alive. Leaning over towards me, it seemed to be pulling up its roots from the softened ground, and to be moving towards me. A mountainous monster, with myriad lips, mumbling together, for my life was upon me. Like one who desperately defends himself from imminent death, I made an effort for life, and fired my gun at the approaching horror. To my dizzied senses the sound seemed far off, but the shock of the recoil partially recalled me to myself, and starting back I reloaded. The shots had torn their way into the soft body of the great thing. The trunk, as it received the wound, shuddered, and the whole tree was struck with a sudden quiver. A fruit fell down, slipping from the leaves, now rigid with swollen veins as from carven foliage. Then I saw a large arm slowly droop, and without a sound it was severed from the juice-fattened bowl, and sank down softly, noiselessly, through the glistening leaves. I fired again, and another vile fragment was powerless, dead. At each discharge the terrible vegetable yielded a life. Piecemeal I attacked it, killing here a leaf and there a branch. My fury increased with the slaughter, till, when my ammunition was exhausted, the splendid giant was left a wreck, as if some hurricane had torn through it. On the ground lay heaped together the fragments, struggling, rising and falling, gasping. Over them drooped in dying languor a few stricken boughs, while upright in the midst stood, dripping at every joint, the glistening trunk. My continued firing had brought up one of my men on my mule. He dared not, so he told me, come near me, thinking me mad. I had now drawn my hunting knife, and with this was fighting with the leaves. Yes, but each leaf was instinct with a horrid life, and more than once I felt my hand entangled for a moment, and seized as if by sharp lips. Ignorant of the presence of my companion, I made a rush forward over the fallen foliage, and with a last paroxysm of frenzy drove my knife up to the handle into the soft bowl, and slipping on the fast congealing sap, fell exhausted and unconscious among the still panting leaves. My companions carried me back to the camp, and after vainly searching for Otona, awaited my return to consciousness. 2 or 3 hours elapsed before I could speak, and several days before I could approach the terrible thing. My men would not go near it. It was quite dead, for as we came up, a great-billed bird, with gaudy plumage that had been securely feasting on the decaying fruit, flew up from the wreck. We removed the rotting foliage, and there, among the dead leaves still limp with juices, and piled round the roots, we found the ghastly relics of many former meals, and, its last nourishment, the corpse of little Otona. To have removed the leaves would have taken too long, so we buried the body as it was, with 100 vampire leaves still clinging to it. Such, as nearly as I remember it, was my uncle's story of the man-eating tree. End of The Man-Eating Tree by Phil Robinson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.
The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august tastes. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers, and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave the means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these in security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. These were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one of a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There were no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite there stood, up opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the fire light that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment, also, that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro, with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the walters perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and, while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to each other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great feat, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure that they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been seen since Hernani. There were arabesque features and unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock, which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then for a moment all is still, and all is silent, save the voices of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live, and ride to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies to the most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the makers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went wearingly through, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened perhaps that more of thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz, or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms which I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such a sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests. There are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closet scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. But the murmur had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. The vesture was dabbed in blood, and his browed brow, with all the features of the face, were besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was bold and a robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the room to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of the deadly terror that had seized upon them all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached, in rapid impetuously, to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterwards, fell prostrate in death was Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and, seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask, which they had handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedwetted halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and the darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. This has been The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe.
The Mezzotint by M.R. James. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by N.R. Collard. The Mezzotint by M.R. James. Some time ago I believe I had the pleasure of telling you the story of an adventure which happened to a friend of mine by the name of Denniston during his pursuit of objects of art for the museum at Cambridge. He did not publish his experiences very widely upon his return to England, but they could not fail to become known to a good many of his friends, and among others to the gentleman who at that time presided over an art museum at another university. It was to be expected that the story should make a considerable impression on the mind of a man whose vocation lay in lines similar to Denniston's, and that he should be eager to catch at any explanation of the matter which tended to make it seem improbable that he should ever be called upon to deal with so agitating an emergency. It was indeed somewhat consoling to him to reflect that he was not expected to acquire ancient manuscripts for his institution. That was the business of the Shelburnian Library. The authorities of that institution might, if they pleased, ransack obscure corners of the continent for such matters. He was glad to be obliged at the moment to confine his attention to enlarging the already unsurpassed collection of English topographical drawings and engravings possessed by his museum. Yet, as it turned out, even a department so homely and familiar as this may have its dark corners, and to one of these Mr. Williams was unexpectedly introduced. Those who have taken even the most limited interest in the acquisition of topographical pictures are aware that there is one London dealer whose aid is indispensable to their researches. Mr. J. W. Britnell publishes at short intervals very admirable catalogues of a large and constantly changing stock of engravings, plans, and old sketches of mansions, churches and towns in England and Wales. These catalogues were, of course, the ABC of his subject to Mr. Williams, but as his museum already contained an enormous accumulation of topographical pictures, he was a regular rather than a copious buyer, and he rather looked to Mr. Britnell to fill up gaps in the rank and file of his collection than to supply him with rarities. Now in February of last year there appeared on Mr. Williams's desk at the museum a catalogue from Mr. Britnell's emporium, and accompanying it was a typewritten communication from the dealer himself. This letter ran as follows. Dear Sir, we beg to call your attention to number 978 in our accompanying catalogue, which we shall be glad to send on approval. Yours faithfully, J. W. Britnell. To turn to number 978 in the accompanying catalogue was, with Mr. Williams, as he observed to himself, the work of a moment, and in the place indicated he found the following entry. 978, unknown, interesting Mezzotint, view of a manor house, early part of the century, 15 by 10 inches, black frame, £2 2s. It was not specially exciting and the price seemed high. However, as Mr. Britnell, who knew his business and his customer, seemed to set store by it, Mr. Williams wrote a postcard asking for the article to be sent on approval, along with some other engravings and sketches which appeared in the same catalogue. And so he passed without much excitement of anticipation to the ordinary labours of the day. A parcel of any kind always arrives a day later than you expected, and that of Mr. Britnell proved, as I believe the right phrase goes, no exception to the rule. It was delivered at the museum by the afternoon post of Saturday, after Mr. Williams had left his work, and it was accordingly brought round to his rooms in college by the attendant, in order that he might not have to wait over Sunday before looking through it and returning such of the contents as he did not propose to keep. And here he found it when he came to tea with a friend. The only item with which I am concerned was the rather large black-framed Mezzotint of which I have already quoted the short description given in Mr. Britnell's catalogue. Some more details of it will have to be given, though I cannot hope to put before you the look of the picture as clearly as it is present to my own eye. Very nearly the exact duplicate of it may be seen in a good many old inn parlours or in the passages of undisturbed country mansions at the present moment. It was a rather indifferent mezzotint, and an indifferent mezzotint is, perhaps, the worst form of engraving known. It presented a full-face view of a not very large manor house of the last century, with 3 rows of plain-sashed windows with rusticated masonry about them, a parapet with balls or vases at the angles, and a small portico in the centre. On either side were trees, and in front a considerable expanse of lawn. The legend AWF Sculpsit was engraved on the narrow margin, and there was no further inscription. The whole thing gave the impression that it was the work of an amateur. What in the world Mr. Britnell could mean by affixing the price of £2 2s to such an object was more than Mr. Williams could imagine. He turned it over with a good deal of contempt. Upon the back was a paper label, the left-hand half of which had been torn off. All that remained were the ends of 2 lines of writing. The first had the letters NGLEY Hall, the second SSEX. It would perhaps be just worthwhile to identify the place represented, which he could easily do with the help of a gazetteer, and then he would send it back to Mr. Britnell with some remarks reflecting upon the judgment of that gentleman. He lighted the candles, for it was now dark, made the tea, and supplied the friend with whom he had been playing golf, for I believe the authorities of the university I write of indulge in that pursuit by way of relaxation, and tea was taken to the accompaniment of a discussion which golfing persons can imagine for themselves, but which the conscientious writer has no right to inflict upon any non-golfing persons. The conclusion arrived at was that certain strokes might have been better, and that in certain emergencies neither player had experienced the amount of luck which a human being has a right to expect. It was now that the friend, let us call him Professor Binks, took up the framed engraving and said, "What's this place, Williams?" "Just what I'm going to try to find out," said Williams, going to the shelf for a gazetteer. "Look at the back. Somethingly Hall, either in Sussex or Essex. Half the name's gone, you see. You don't happen to know it, I suppose?" "It's from that man Britnell, I suppose, isn't it?" said Binks. "Is it for the museum?" "Well, I think I should buy it if the price was 5 shillings," said Williams. "But for some unearthly reason he wants 2 guineas for it. I can't conceive why. It's a wretched engraving, and there aren't even any figures to give it life." "It's not worth 2 guineas, I should think," said Binks. "But I don't think it's so badly done. The moonlight seems rather good to me, and I should have thought there were figures, or at least a figure, just on the edge in front." "Let's look," said Williams. "Well, it's true the light is rather cleverly given. Where's your figure?" "Oh, yes, just the head in the very front of the picture." And indeed there was, hardly more than a black blot on the extreme edge of the engraving, the head of a man or woman, a good deal muffled up, the back turned to the spectator and looking towards the house. Williams had not noticed it before. "Still," he said, "though it's a cleverer thing than I thought, I can't spend 2 guineas of museum money on a picture of a place I don't know." Professor Binks had his work to do and soon went, and very nearly up to hall time Williams was engaged in a vain attempt to identify the subject of his picture. If the vowel before the NG had only been left, it would have been easy enough, he thought, but as it is, the name may be anything from Guestingley to Langley, and there are many more names ending like this than I thought, and this rotten book is no index of terminations. Hall in Mr. Williams' College was at 7. It need not be dwelt upon, the less so as he met there colleagues who had been playing golf during the afternoon, and words with which we have no concern were freely bandied across the table. Merely golfing words, I would hasten to explain. I suppose an hour or more to have been spent in what is called common room after dinner. Later in the evening some few retired to Williams's room, and I have little doubt that whist was played and tobacco smoked. During a lull in these operations, Williams picked up the Mezzotint from the table without looking at it, and handed it to a person mildly interested in art, telling him where it had come from and the other particulars which we already know. The gentleman took it carelessly, looked at it, and then said, in a tone of some interest, "It's really a very good piece of work, Williams. It has quite a feeling of the romantic period. The light is admirably managed, it seems to me, and the figure, though it's rather too grotesque, is somehow very impressive." "Yes, isn't it?" said Williams, who was just then busy giving whisky and soda to the others of the company, and was unable to come across the room to look at the view again. It was by this time rather late in the evening, and the visitors were on the move. After they went, Williams was obliged to write a letter or two and clear up some odd bits of work. At last, some time past midnight, he was disposed to turn in, and he put out his lamp after lighting his bedroom candle. The picture lay face upwards on the table, where the last man who looked at it had put it, and it caught his eye as he turned the lamp down. What he saw made him very nearly drop the candle on the floor, and he declares now, if he had been left in the dark at that moment, he would have had a fit. But, as that did not happen, he was able to put down the light on the table and take a good look at the picture. It was indubitable. Rankly impossible, no doubt, but absolutely certain. In the middle of the lawn, in front of the unknown house, there was a figure where no figure had been at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It was crawling on all fours towards the house, and it was muffled in a strange black garment with a white cross on the back. I do not know what is the ideal course to pursue in a situation of this kind. I can only tell you what Mr. Williams did. He took the picture by one corner and carried it across the passage to a second set of rooms which he possessed. There he locked it up in a drawer, sported the doors of both sets of rooms, and retired to bed. But first he wrote out and signed an account of the extraordinary change which the picture had undergone since it had come into his possession. Sleep visited him rather late, but it was consoling to reflect that the behaviour of the picture did not depend upon his own unsupported testimony. Evidently the man who had looked at it the night before had seen something of the same kind as he had. Otherwise he might have been tempted to think that something gravely wrong was happening either to his eyes or his mind. This possibility being fortunately precluded, two matters awaited him on the morrow. He must take stock of the picture very carefully and call in a witness for the purpose, and he must make a determined effort to ascertain what house it was that was represented. He would therefore ask his neighbour Nisbet to breakfast with him, and he would subsequently spend the morning over the gazetteer. Nisbet was disengaged and arrived around 9:20. His host was not quite dressed, I am sorry to say, even at this late hour. During breakfast nothing was said about the Mezzotint by Williams, save that he had a picture on which he wished for Nisbet's opinion. But those who are familiar with university life can picture for themselves the wide and delightful range of subjects over which the conversation of two fellows of Canterbury College is likely to extend during a Sunday morning breakfast. Hardly a topic was left unchallenged, from golf to lawn tennis. Yet I am bound to say that Williams was rather distraught, for his interest naturally centred on that very strange picture which was now reposing face down in the drawer in the room opposite. The morning pipe was at last lighted, and the moment had arrived for which he looked. With very considerable, almost tremulous excitement, he ran across, unlocked the drawer, and, extracting the picture, still face downwards, ran back and put it into Nisbet's hands. "Now," he said, "Nisbet, I want you to tell me exactly what you see in that picture. Describe it, if you don't mind, rather minutely. I'll tell you why afterwards." "Well," said Nisbet, "I have here a view of a country house, English, I presume, by moonlight." "Moonlight? You're sure of that?" "Certainly. The moon appears to be on the wane, if you wish for details, and there are clouds in the sky." All right, go on. I'll swear, added Williams in an aside. There was no moon when I saw it first. Well, there's not much more to be said, Nisbet continued. The house is 1, 2, 3 rows of windows, 5 in each row except at the bottom, where there's a porch instead of a middle one, and— But what about the figures? Said Williams with marked interest. There aren't any, said Nisbet. But what? No figure on the grass in front? Not a thing. You'll swear to that? Certainly I will. But there's just one other thing. What? Why, one of the windows on the ground floor, left of the door, is open. Is it really so? My goodness, he must have got in, said Williams with great excitement, and he hurried to the back of the sofa on which Nisbet was sitting, and catching the picture from him, verified the matter for himself. It was quite true. There was no figure. And there was the open window. Williams, after a moment of speechless surprise, went to the writing table and scribbled for a short time. Then he brought 2 papers to Nisbet, and asked him first to sign one. It was his own description of the picture, which you have just heard, and then to read the other, which was William's statement written the night before. What can it all mean? Said Nisbet. Exactly, said Williams. Well, one thing I must do, or 3 things now I think of it. I must find out from Garwood, this was his last night's visitor, what he saw, and then I must get the thing photographed before it goes further, and then I must find out what the place is. I can do the photographing myself, said Nisbet, and I will. But you know, it looks very much as if we were assisting at the working out of a tragedy somewhere. The question is, has it happened already, or is it going to come off? You must find out what the place is. Yes, he said, looking at the picture again. I expect you're right, he has got in, and if I don't mistake, there'll be the devil to pay in one of the rooms upstairs. I'll tell you what, said Williams. I'll take the picture across to old Green. This was the senior fellow of the college who had been bursar for many years. It's quite likely he'll know it. We have property in Essex and Sussex, and he must have been over the 2 counties a lot in his time. Quite likely he will, said Nisbet. But just let me take my photograph first. But look here, I rather think Green isn't up today. He wasn't in the hall last night, and I think I heard him say he was going down for the Sunday. That's true too, said Williams. I know he's gone to Brighton. Well, if you'll photograph it now, I'll go across to Garwood and get his statement, and you keep an eye on it while I'm gone. I'm beginning to think 2 guineas is not a very exorbitant price for it now. In a short time he had returned and brought Mr. Garwood with him. Garwood's statement was to the effect that the figure, when he had seen it, was clear of the edge of the picture, but had not got far across the lawn. He remembered a white mark on the back of its drapery, but could not have been sure it was a cross. A document to this effect was then drawn up and signed, and Nisbet proceeded to photograph the picture. Now what do you mean to do? He said. Are you going to sit and watch it all day? Well, no, I think not, said Williams. I rather imagine we're meant to see the whole thing. You see, between the time I saw it last night and this morning, there was time for lots of things to happen, but the creature only got into the house. It could easily have got through its business in the time and gone to its own place again. But the fact of the window being open, I think, must mean that it's in there now. So I feel quite easy about leaving it. And besides, I have a kind of idea that it wouldn't change much, if at all, in the daytime. We might go out for a walk this afternoon and come in to tea, or whenever it gets dark. I shall leave it out on the table here and sport the door. My skip can get in, but no one else. The 3 agreed that this would be a good plan, and further that if they spend the afternoon together, they would be less likely to talk about their business to other people, for any rumour of such a transaction as it was going on would bring the whole of the Phasmatological Society about their ears. We may give them respite until 5 o'clock. At or near that hour the 3 were entering Williams's staircase. They were at first slightly annoyed to see that the door of his rooms was unsported, but in a moment It was remembered that on Sunday the skips came for orders an hour or so earlier than on weekdays. However, a surprise was awaiting them. The first thing they saw was the picture leaning up against a pile of books on the table, as it had been left, and the next thing was Williams's skip, seated on a chair opposite, gazing at it with undisguised horror. How was this? Mr. Filcher, the name is not my own invention, was a servant of considerable standing, and set the standard of etiquette to all his own college and to several neighbouring ones, and nothing could be more alien to his practice than to be found sitting on his master's chair or appearing to take any particular notice of his master's furniture or pictures. Indeed, he seemed to feel this himself. He started violently when the three men were in the room and got up with a marked effort. Then he said, "I ask your pardon, sir, for taking such a freedom as to set down." "Not at all, Robert," interposed Mr. Williams. "I was meaning to ask you some time what you thought of that picture." "Well, sir, of course, I don't set up my opinion against yours, but it ain't the picture I would hang where my little girl could see it, sir." "Wouldn't you, Robert? Why not?" "No, sir, why? The poor child, I recollect once she see a door Bible with pictures not half as what this is, and we'd had to set up with her 3 or 4 nights afterwards, if you'll believe me. And if she was to catch a sight of this skeleton here, or whatever it is, carrying off the poor baby, she would be in a taking. You know how it is with children, how nervous they get, with a little thing and all. But what I should say, it don't seem a right picture to be laying about, sir, not where anyone that's liable to be startled could come on it. Should you be wanting anything this evening, sir?" "Thank you, sir." With these words, the excellent man went to continue the round of his masters, and you may be sure the gentleman whom he left lost no time in gathering round the engraving. There was the house, as before, under the waning moon and the drifting clouds. The window that had been open was shut, and the figure was once more on the lawn, but not this time crawling cautiously on hands and knees. Now it was erect and stepping swiftly with long strides towards the front of the picture. The moon was behind it, and the black drapery hung down over its face so that only hints of that could be seen, and what was visible made the spectators profoundly thankful that they could see no more than a white dome-like forehead and a few straggling hairs. The head was bent down, and the arms were tightly clasped over an object which could be dimly seen and identified as a child. Whether dead or living it was not possible to say. The legs of the appearance alone could be plainly discerned, and they were horribly thin. From 5 to 7 the 3 companions sat and watched the picture by turns, but it never changed. They agreed at last that it would be safe to leave it, and that they would return after hall and await further developments. When they assembled again at the earliest possible moment, the engraving was there, but the figure was gone, and the house was quiet under the moonbeams. There was nothing for it but to spend the evening over gazetteers and guidebooks. Williams was the lucky one at last, and perhaps he deserved it. At 11:30 p.m. he read, from Murray's Guide to Essex, the following lines. 16.5 miles, Anningley. The church has been an interesting building of Norman date, but was extensively classicised in the last century. It contains the tomb of the family of Francis, whose mansion, Anningley Hall, a solid Queen Anne house, stands immediately beyond the churchyard in a park of about 80 acres. The family is now extinct, the last heir having disappeared mysteriously in infancy in the year 1802. The father, Mr. Arthur Francis, was locally known as a talented amateur engraver of Mezzotint. After his son's disappearance he lived in complete retirement at the Hall, and was found dead in his studio on the 3rd anniversary of the disaster, having just completed an engraving of the house, impressions of which are of considerable rarity. This looked like business, and indeed Mr. Green, on his return, at once identified the house as Anningley Hall. "Is there any kind of explanation of the figure, Green?" was the question which Williams naturally asked. "I don't know, I'm sure, Williams. What used to be said in the place when I first knew it, which was before I came up here, was just this: old Francis was always very much down on these poaching fellows, and whenever he got a chance, he used to get a man whom he suspected of it turned off the estate, and by degrees he got rid of them all but one. Squires could do a lot of things then that they daren't think of now. Well, this man that was left was what you find pretty often in that country, the last remains of a very old family. I believe they were lords of the manor at one time. I recollect just the same thing in my own parish. What, like the man in Tessot and d'Urberville's? Williams put in. Yes, I dare say. It's not a book I could ever read myself, but this fellow could show a row of tombs in the church there that belonged to his ancestors, and all that went to sour him a bit, but Francis, they said, could never get at him. He always kept just on the right side of the law, until one night the keepers found him at it in a wood at the end of the estate. I could show you the place now. It marches with some land that used to belong to an uncle of mine. And you can imagine there was a row, and this man, Gaudy. That was his name, to be sure, Gaudy. I thought I should get it. Gaudy. He was unlucky enough, poor chap, to shoot a keeper. Well, that was what Francis wanted, and grand juries. You know what they would have been then. And poor Gaudy was strung up in double quick time, and I've been shown the place he was buried in on the north side of the church. You know the way in that part of the world. Anyone that's been hanged or made away with themselves, they bury them that side. And the idea was that some friend of Gaudy's, not a relation because he had none, poor devil, he was the last of his line, kind of spes ultimo gentis, must have planned to get hold of Francis's boy, and put an end to his line too. I don't know, it's rather an out-of-the-way thing for an Essex poacher to think of, but, you know, I should say now it looks more as if old Gaudy had managed the job himself. Oh, I hate to think of it. Have some whisky, Williams. The facts were communicated by Williams to Denniston, and by him to a mixed company, of which I was one, and the Seducian professor of ophiology another. I am sorry to say that the latter, when asked what he thought of it, only remarked, "Oh, those Bridgeford people will say anything." A sentiment which met with the reception it deserved. I have only to add that the picture is now in the Ashley Museum, that it has been treated with a view to discover whether sympathetic ink has been used in it, but without effect, that Mr. Britnell knew nothing of it, save that he was sure it was uncommon, and that, though carefully watched, it has never been known to change again. End of the Mezzotint.
Story of an Obstinate Corpse by Elia Wilkinson Peedy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Story of an Obstinate Corpse. Virgil Hoyt is a photographer's assistant up at St. Paul and enjoys his work without being consumed by it. He has been in search of the picturesque all over the West and hundreds of miles to the north in Canada, and can speak 3 or 4 Indian dialects and put a canoe through the rapids. That is to say, he is a man of adventure and no dreamer. He can fight well and shoot better, and swim so as to put up a winning race with the Indian boys, and he can sit in the saddle all day and not worry about it tomorrow. Wherever he goes, he carries a camera. The world, Hoyt is in the habit of saying to those who sit with him when he smokes his pipe, was created in 6 days to be photographed. Man, and particularly woman, was made for the same purpose. Clouds are not made to give moisture, nor trees to cast shade. They have been created in order to give the camera obscura something to do. In short, Virgil Hoyt's view of the world is whimsical, and he likes to be bothered neither with the disagreeable nor the mysterious. That is the reason he loathes and detests going to a house of mourning to photograph a corpse. The bad taste of it offends him, but, above all, he doesn't like the necessity of shouldering, even for a few moments, a part of the burden of sorrow which belongs to someone else. He dislikes sorrow, and would willingly canoe 500 miles up the cold Canadian River to get rid of it. Nevertheless, as assistant photographer, it is often his duty to do this very kind of thing. Not long ago, he was sent for by a rich Jewish family to photograph the remains of the mother, who had just died. He was put out, but he was only an assistant, and he went. He was taken to the front parlor, where the dead woman lay in her coffin. It was evident to him that there was some excitement in the household, and that a discussion was going on. But Hoyt said to himself that it didn't concern him, and he therefore paid no attention to it. The daughter wanted the coffin turned on end in order that the corpse might face the camera properly, but Hoyt said he could overcome the recumbent attitude and make it appear that the face was taken in the position it would naturally hold in life. And so they went out and left him alone with the dead. The face of the deceased was a strong and positive one, such as may often be seen among Jewish matrons. Hoyt regarded it with some admiration, thinking to himself that she was a woman who had known what she wanted, and who, once having made up her mind, would prove immovable. Such a character appealed to Hoyt. He reflected that he might have married, if only he could have found a woman with strength of character sufficient to disagree with him. There was a strand of hair out of place on the dead woman's brow, and he gently pushed it back. A bud lifted its head too high from among the roses on her breast and spoiled the contour of the chin, so he broke it off. He remembered these things later with keen distinctness, and that his hand touched her chill face 2 or 3 times in the making of his arrangements. Then he took the impression and left the house. He was busy at the time with some railroad work, and several days passed before he found opportunity to develop the plates. He took them from the bath in which they had lain with a number of others and went energetically to work upon them, whistling some very saucy songs he had learned of the guide in the Red River country, and trying to forget that the face which was presently to appear was that of a dead woman. He had used 3 plates as a precaution against accident, and they came up well. But as they developed, he became aware of the existence of something in the photograph which had not been apparent to his eye in the subject. He was irritated, and without attempting to face the mystery, he made a few prints and laid them aside, ardently hoping that by some chance they would never be called for. However, as luck would have it, and Hoyt's luck never had been good, his employer asked one day what had become of those photographs. Hoyt tried to evade making an answer, but the effort was futile, and he had to get out the finished prints and exhibit them. The older man sat staring at them a long time. "Hoyt," he said, "you're a young man, and very likely you have never seen anything like this before, but I have. Not exactly the same thing, perhaps, but similar phenomena have come my way a number of times since I went in the business, and I want to tell you there are things in heaven and earth not dreamt of." "Oh, I know all that tommyrot," cried Hoyt angrily, "but when anything happens I want to know the reason why and how it is done." "All right," answered his employer, "then you might explain why and how the sun rises." But he humored the young man sufficiently to examine with him the baths in which the plates were submerged, and the plates themselves. All was as it should be, but the mystery was there, and could not be done away with. Hoyt hoped against hope that the friends of the dead woman would somehow forget about the photographs. But the idea was unreasonable, and one day, as a matter of course, the daughter appeared and asked to see the pictures of her mother. "Well, to tell the truth," stammered Hoyt, "they didn't come out quite as well as we could wish." "But let me see them," persisted the lady. "I'd like to look at them anyhow." "Well now," said Hoyt, trying to be soothing, as he believed it was always best to be with women. To tell the truth, he was an ignoramus where women were concerned. "I think it would be better if you didn't look at them. There are reasons why he ambled on like this, stupid man that he was, till the lady naturally insisted upon seeing the pictures without a moment's delay." So poor Hoyt brought them out and placed them in her hand, and then ran for the water pitcher, and had to be at the bother of bathing her forehead to keep her from fainting. For what the lady saw was this: over face and flowers and the head of the coffin lay a thick veil, the edges of which touched the floor in some places. It covered the features so well that not a hint of them was visible. "There was nothing over mother's face," cried the lady at length. "Not a thing," acquiesced Hoyt. "I know, because I had occasion to touch her face just before I took the picture. I put some of her hair back from her brow. "What does it mean, then?" asked the lady. "You know better than I. There is no explanation in science. Perhaps there is some in psychology." "Well," said the young woman, stammering a little and coloring, "Mother was a good woman, but she always wanted her own way, and she always had it, too." "Yes?" "And she never would have her picture taken. She didn't admire her own appearance. She said no one should ever see a picture of her." "So," said Hoyt meditatively. "Well, she's kept her word, hasn't she?" The two stood looking at the photographs for a time. Then Hoyt pointed to the open blaze in the grate. "Throw them in," he commanded. "Don't let your father see them. Don't keep them yourself. They wouldn't be agreeable things to keep." "That's true enough," admitted the lady, and she threw them in the fire. Then Virgil Hoyt brought out the plates and broke them before her eyes. And that was the end of it, except that Hoyt sometimes tells the story to those who sit beside him when his pipe is lighted. End of Story of an Obstinate Corpse by Elia Wilkinson Peedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The Premature Burial by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. The Premature Burial by Edgar Allan Poe. There are certain themes of which the interest is all absorbing, but which are too entirely horrible for the purposes of legitimate fiction. These the mere romanticist must eschew, if he do not wish to offend or to disgust. They are without propriety handled only when the severity and majesty of truth sanctify and sustain them. We thrill, for example, with the most intense of pleasurable pain over the accounts of the passage of the Beresina, of the earthquake at Lisbon, of the plague at London, of the massacre of St. Bartholomew, or of the stifling of the 123 prisoners in the Black Hole at Calcutta. But in these accounts it is the fact, it is the reality, it is the history which excites. As inventions we should regard them with simple abhorrence. I have mentioned some few of the more prominent and august calamities on record, but in these it is the extent, not less than the character of the calamity, which so vividly impresses the fancy. I need not remind the reader that, from the long and weird catalogue of human miseries, I might have selected many individual instances more replete with essential suffering than any of these vast generalities of disaster. The true wretchedness, indeed the ultimate woe, is particular, not diffuse. That the ghastly extremes of agony are endured by men the unit, and never by men the mass, for this let us thank a merciful God. To be buried while alive is, beyond question, the most terrific of these extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. That it has frequently, very frequently, so fallen, will scarcely be denied by those who think. The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins? We know that there are diseases in which occur total cessations of all the apparent functions of vitality, and yet in which these cessations are merely suspensions, properly so called. They are only temporary pauses in the incomprehensible mechanism. A certain period elapses, and some unseen mysterious principle again sets in motion the magic pinions and the wizard wheels. The silver cord was not for ever loosed, nor the golden bowl irreparably broken. But where, meantime, was the soul? Apart, however, from the inevitable conclusion, a priori that such causes must produce such effects, that the well-known occurrence of such cases of suspended animation must naturally give rise, now and then, to premature interments, apart from this consideration, we have the direct testimony of medical and ordinary experience, to prove that a vast number of such interments have actually taken place. I might refer at once, if necessary, to 100 well authenticated instances. One of very remarkable character, and of which the circumstances may be fresh in the memory of some of my readers, occurred, not very long ago, in the neighbouring city of Baltimore, where it occasioned a painful, intense, and widely extended excitement. the wife of one of the most respectable citizens, a lawyer of eminence and a member of Congress, was seized with a sudden and unaccountable illness, which completely baffled the skill of her physicians. After much suffering she died, or was supposed to die. No one suspected, indeed, or had a reason to suspect, that she was not actually dead. She presented all the ordinary appearances of death. The face assumed the usual pinched and sunken outline. The lips were of the usual marble pallor. The eyes were lustreless. There was no warmth. Pulsation had ceased. For 3 days the body was preserved unburied, during which it had acquired a stony rigidity. The funeral, in short, was hastened, on account of the rapid advance of what was supposed to be decomposition. The lady was deposited in her family vault, which, for 3 subsequent years, was undisturbed. At the expiration of this term it was opened for the reception of a sarcophagus, but, alas! how fearful a shock awaited the husband, who personally threw open the door. As its portals swung outwardly back, some white apparelled object fell rattling within his arms. It was the skeleton of his wife, in her yet unmoulded shroud. A careful investigation rendered it evident that she had revived within 2 days after her entombment, that her struggles within the coffin had caused it to fall from a ledge or shelf to the floor, where it was so broken as to permit her escape. A lamp which had been accidentally left, full of oil, within the tomb, was found empty. It might have been exhausted, however, by evaporation. On the uttermost of the steps which led down into the dread chamber was a large fragment of the coffin, with which it seemed that she had endeavoured to arrest attention by striking the iron door. While thus occupied she probably swooned, or possibly died, through sheer terror, and in failing, her shroud became entangled in some ironwork which projected interiorly. Thus she remained, and thus she rotted, erect. In the year 1810 a case of living inhumation happened in France, attended with circumstances which go far to warrant the assertion that truth is, indeed, stranger than fiction. The heroine of the story was a Mademoiselle Victorine Lafourcade, a young girl of illustrious family, of wealth, and of great personal beauty. Among her numerous suitors was Julien Bossuet, a poor litterateur or journalist of Paris. His talents and general amiability had recommended him to the notice of the heiress, by whom he seems to have been truly beloved, but her pride of birth decided her, finally, to reject him, and to wed a Monsieur Renel, a banker and a diplomatist of some eminence. After marriage, however, this gentleman neglected, and perhaps even more positively ill-treated her. Having passed with him some wretched years, she died. At least her condition so closely resembled death as to deceive every one who saw her. She was buried, not in a vault, but in an ordinary grave, in the village of her nativity. Filled with despair, and still inflamed by the memory of a profound attachment, the lover journeys from the capital to the remote province in which the village lies, with the romantic purpose of disinterring the corpse and possessing himself of its luxuriant tresses. He reaches the grave. At midnight he unnerves the coffin, opens it, and is in the act of detaching the hair, when he is arrested by the unclosing of the beloved eyes. In fact, the lady had been buried alive. Vitality had not altogether departed, and she was aroused by the caresses of her lover from the lethargy which had been mistaken for death. He bore her frantically to his lodgings in the village. He employed certain powerful restoratives, suggested by no little medical learning. In fine, she revived. She recognized her preserver. She remained with him until, by slow degrees, she fully recovered her original health. Her woman's heart was not adamant, and this last lesson of love sufficed to soften it. She bestowed it upon Bossuet. She returned no more to her husband, but concealing from him her resurrection, fled with her lover to America. 20 years afterward the two returned to France, in the persuasion that time had so greatly altered the lady's appearance that her friends would be unable to recognize her. They were mistaken, however, for at the first meeting Monsieur Renel did actually recognize and make claim to his wife. This claim she resisted, and a judicial tribunal sustained her in her resistance, deciding that the peculiar circumstances, with the long lapse of years, had extinguished, not only equitably but legally, the authority of the husband. The Chirurgical Journal of Leipzig, a periodical of high authority and merit, which some American bookseller would do well to translate and republish, records in a late number a very distressing event of the character in question. An officer of artillery, a man of gigantic stature and of robust health, being thrown from an unmanageable horse, received a very severe contusion upon the head, which rendered him insensible at once. The skull was slightly fractured, but no immediate danger was apprehended. Trepanning was accomplished successfully. He was bled, and many other of the ordinary means of relief were adopted. Gradually, however, he fell into a more and more hopeless state of stupor, and finally it was thought he was dead. The weather was warm, and he was buried with indecent haste in one of the public cemeteries. His funeral took place on Thursday. On the Sunday following, the grounds of the cemetery were, as usual, much thronged with visitors, and about noon an intense excitement was created by the declaration of a peasant that, while sitting upon the grave of the officer, he had distinctly felt a commotion of the earth, as if occasioned by some one struggling beneath. At first little attention was paid to the man's asseverations, but his evident terror and the dogged obstinacy with which he persisted in his story had at length their natural effect upon the crowd. Spades were hurriedly procured, and the grave, which was shamefully shallow, was in a few minutes so far thrown open that the head of its occupant appeared. He was then seemingly dead, but he sat nearly erect within his coffin, the lid of which, in his furious struggles, he had partially uplifted. He was forthwith conveyed to the nearest hospital, and there pronounced to be still living, although in an asphytic condition. After some hours he revived, recognized individuals of his acquaintance, and in broken sentences spoke of his agonies in the grave. From what he revealed it was clear that he must have been conscious of life for more than an hour, while inhumed, before lapsing into insensibility. The grave was carelessly and loosely filled with an exceedingly porous soil, and thus some air was necessarily admitted. He heard the footsteps of the crowd overhead, and endeavoured to make himself heard in turn. It was the tumult within the grounds of the cemetery, he said, which appeared to awaken him from a deep sleep, but no sooner was he awake than he became fully aware of the awful horrors of his position. This patient, it is recorded, was doing well, and seemed to be in a fair way of ultimate recovery, but fell a victim to the quackeries of medical experiment. The galvanic battery was applied, and he suddenly expired in one of those ecstatic paroxysms which, occasionally, it superinduces. The mention of the galvanic battery, nevertheless, recalls to my memory a well known and very extraordinary case in point, where its action proved the means of restoring to animation a young attorney of London, who had been interred for 2 days. This occurred in 1831, and created, at the time, a very profound sensation wherever it was made the subject of converse. The patient, Mr. Edward Stapleton, had died, apparently of typhus fever, accompanied with some anomalous symptoms which had excited the curiosity of his medical attendants. Upon his seeming decease, his friends were requested to sanction a post mortem examination, but declined to permit it. As often happens, when such refusals are made, the practitioners resolved to disinter the body and dissect it at leisure, in private. Arrangements were easily effected with some of the numerous corps of body snatchers with which London abounds, and upon the 3rd night after the funeral the supposed corpse was unearthed from a grave 8 feet deep, and deposited in the opening chamber of one of the private hospitals. An incision of some extent had been actually made in the abdomen, when the fresh and undecayed appearance of the subject suggested an application of the battery. One experiment succeeded another, and the customary effects supervened, with nothing to characterize them in any respect, except upon 1 or 2 occasions a more than ordinary degree of lifelikeness in the convulsive action. It grew late, the day was about to dawn, and it was thought expedient, at length, to proceed at once to the dissection. A student, however, was especially desirous of testing a theory of his own, and insisted upon applying the battery to one of the pectoral muscles. A rough gash was made, and a wire hastily brought in contact, when the patient, with a hurried but quite unconvulsive movement, arose from the table, stepped into the middle of the floor, gazed upon him uneasily for a few seconds, and then spoke. What he said was unintelligible, but words were uttered, the syllabification was distinct. Having spoken, he fell heavily to the floor. For some moments all were paralysed with awe, but the urgency of the case soon restored them their presence of mind. It was seen that Mr. Stapleton was alive, although in a swoon. Upon exhibition of ether he revived, and was rapidly restored to health and to the society of his friends, from whom, however, all knowledge of his resuscitation was withheld, until a relapse was no longer to be apprehended. Their wonder, their rapturous astonishment, may be conceived. The most thrilling peculiarity of this incident, nevertheless, is involved in what Mr. S. himself asserts. He declares that at no period was he altogether insensible, that, dully and confusedly, he was aware of everything which happened to him, from the moment in which he was pronounced dead by his physicians, to that in which he fell swooning to the floor of the hospital. "I am alive," were the uncomprehended words, which upon recognizing the locality of the dissecting room he had endeavoured, in his extremity, to utter. It were an easy matter to multiply such histories as these, but I forbear, for indeed we have no need for such to establish the fact that premature interment occurs. When we reflect how very rarely, from the nature of the case, we have it in our power to detect them, we must admit that they may frequently occur without our cognizance. Scarcely, in truth, is a graveyard ever encroached upon, for any purpose, to any great extent, that skeletons are not found in postures which suggest the most fearful of suspicions. Fearful indeed the suspicion, but more fearful the doom. It may be asserted without hesitation that no event is so terribly well adapted to inspire the supremeness of bodily and of mental distress as is burial before death. The unendurable oppression of the lungs, the stifling fumes from the damp earth, the clinging to the death garments, the rigid embrace of the narrow house, the blackness of the absolute night, the silence like a sea that overwhelms, the unseen but palpable presence of the conqueror worm. These things, with the thoughts of the air and grass above, with memory of dear friends who would fly to save us if but informed of our fate, and with consciousness that of this fate they can never be informed, that our hopeless position is that of the really dead. These considerations, I say, carry into the heart, which still palpitates, a degree of appalling and intolerable horror from which the most daring imagination must recoil. We know of nothing so agonizing upon death, we can dream of nothing half so hideous in the realms of the nethermost hell. And thus all narratives upon this topic have an interest profound, an interest, nevertheless, which through the sacred awe of the topic itself, very properly and very peculiarly depends upon our conviction of the truth of the matter narrated. What I have now to tell is of my own actual knowledge, of my own positive and personal experience. For several years I had been subject to attacks of the singular disorder which physicians have agreed to term catalepsy, in default of a more definitive term. Although both the immediate and the predisposing causes, and even the actual diagnosis, of this disease are still mysterious, its obvious and apparent character is sufficiently well understood. Its variations seem to be chiefly of degree. Sometimes the patient lies for a day only, or even for a shorter period, in a species of exaggerated lethargy. He is senseless and externally motionless, but the pulsation of the heart is still faintly perceptible. Some traces of warmth remain, a slight colour lingers within the centre of the cheek, and upon application of a mirror to the lips we can detect a torpid, unequal, and vacillating action of the lungs. Then again the duration of the trance is for weeks, even for months. While the closest scrutiny and the most rigorous medical tests fail to establish any material distinction between the state of the sufferer and what we conceive of absolute death. Very usually he is saved from premature interment solely by the knowledge of his friends that he has been previously subject to catalepsy, by the consequent suspicion excited, and above all by the non-appearance of decay. The advances of the malady are luckily gradual. The first manifestations, although marked, are unequivocal. The fits grow successively more and more distinctive, and endure each for a longer term than the preceding. In this lies the principal security from inhumation. The unfortunate whose first attack should be of the extreme character which is occasionally seen, would almost inevitably be consigned alive to the tomb. My own case differed in no important particular from those mentioned in medical books. Sometimes, without any apparent cause, I sank little by little into a condition of hemi-syncope, or half swoon, and in this condition, without pain, without ability to stir, or strictly speaking to think, but with a dull lethargic consciousness of life, and of the presence of those who surround my bed, I remained until the crisis of the disease restored me, suddenly, to perfect sensation. At other times I was quickly and impetuously smitten. I grew sick and numb and chilly and dizzy, and so fell prostrate at once. Then for weeks all was void and black and silent, and nothing became the universe. Total annihilation could be no more. From these latter attacks I awoke, however, with a gradation slow in proportion to the suddenness of the seizure. Just as the day dawns to the friendless and houseless beggar who roams the streets throughout the long desolate winter night, just so tardily, just so wearily, just so cheerily came back the light of the soul to me. Apart from the tendency to trance, however, my general health appeared to be good, nor could I perceive that it was at all affected by the one prevalent malady, unless, indeed, an idiosyncrasy in my ordinary sleep may be looked upon as superinduced. Upon awaking from slumber I could never gain at once thorough possession of my senses, and always remained, for many minutes, in much bewilderment and perplexity, the mental faculties in general, but the memory in especial, being in a condition of absolute abeyance. In all that I endured there was no physical suffering, but of moral distress an infinitude. My fancy grew charnel, I talked of worms, of tombs, and of epitaphs. I was lost in reveries of death, and the idea of premature burial held continual possession of my brain. The ghastly danger to which I was subjected haunted me day and night. In the former the torture of meditation was excessive, in the latter supreme. When the grim darkness overspread the earth, then, with every horror of thought, I shook as the quivering plumes upon the hairs. When nature could endure wakefulness no longer, it was with a struggle that I consented to sleep, for I shuddered to reflect that, upon awakening, I might find myself the tenant of a grave. And when, finally, I sank into slumber, it was only to rush at once into a world of phantasms, above which the vast, sable, overshadowing wing hovered predominant, the one sepulchral idea. From the innumerable images of gloom which thus oppressed me in dreams, I select for record but a solitary vision. Methought I was immersed in a cataleptic trance of more than usual duration and profundity. Suddenly there came an icy hand upon my forehead, and an impatient, gibbering voice whispered the word "Arise!" within my ear. I sat erect. The darkness was total. I could not see the figure of him who had aroused me. I could call to mind neither the period at which I had fallen into the trance, nor the locality in which I then lay. While I remained motionless, and busied in endeavours to collect my thoughts, the cold hand grasped me fiercely by the wrist, shaking it petulantly, while the gibbering voice said again, "Arise! Did I not bid thee arise?" "And who," I demanded, "art thou?" "I have no name in the regions which I inhabit," replied the voice mournfully. "I was mortal, but am fiend. I was merciless, but am pitiful. Thou dost feel that I shudder. My teeth chatter as I speak. yet it is not with the chilliness of the night without end. But this hideousness is insufferable. How canst thou tranquilly sleep? I cannot rest for the cry of these great agonies. These sights are more than I can bear. Get thee up, come with me into the outer night, and let me unfold to thee the graves. Is not this a spectacle of woe? Behold!" I looked, and the unseen figure, which still grasped me by the wrist, had caused to be thrown open the graves of all mankind, and from each issued the faint phosphoric radiance of decay, so that I could see into the innermost recesses, and there view the shrouded bodies in their sad and solemn slumbers with the worm. But alas! the real sleepers were fewer, by many millions, than those who slumbered not at all, and there was a feeble struggling, and there was a general sad unrest, and from out the depths of the countless pits there came a melancholy rustling from the garments of the buried. And of those who seemed tranquilly to repose, I saw that a vast number had changed, in a greater or less degree, the rigid and uneasy position in which they had originally been entombed. And the voice again said to me as I gazed, "Is it not, oh, is it not a pitiful sight?" But before I could find words to reply, the figure had ceased to grasp my wrist, the phosphoric lights expired, and the graves were closed with a sudden violence, while from out them arose a tumult of despairing cries, saying again, "Is it not, oh God, is it not a very pitiful sight?" Phantasies such as these, presenting themselves at night, extended their terrific influence far into my waking hours. My nerves became thoroughly unstrung, and I fell a prey to perpetual horror. I hesitated to ride, or to walk, or to indulge in any exercise that would carry me from home. In fact, I no longer dared trust myself out of the immediate presence of those who were aware of my proneness to catalepsy, lest, falling into one of my usual fits, I should be buried before my real condition could be ascertained. I doubted the care, the fidelity of my dearest friends. I dreaded that, in some trance of more than customary duration, they might be prevailed upon to regard me as irrevocable. I even went so far as to fear that, as I occasioned much trouble, they might be glad to consider any very protracted attack as sufficient excuse for getting rid of me altogether. It was in vain they endeavoured to reassure me by the most solemn promises. I exacted the most sacred oaths that under no circumstances they would bury me until decomposition had so materially advanced as to render further preservation impossible. And even then my mortal terrors would listen to no reason, would accept no consolation. I entered into a series of elaborate precautions. Among other things, I had the family vault so remodelled as to admit of being readily opened from within. The slightest pressure upon a long lever that extended far into the tomb would cause the iron portal to fly back. There were arrangements also for the free admission of air and light, and convenient receptacles for food and water, within immediate reach of the coffin intended for my reception. This coffin was warmly and softly padded, and was provided with a lid, fashioned upon the principle of the vault door, with the addition of springs so contrived that the feeblest movement of the body would be sufficient to set it at liberty. Besides all this, there was suspended from the roof of the tomb a large bell, the rope of which, it was designed, should extend through a hole in the coffin, and so be fastened to one of the hands of the corpse. But alas! what avails the vigilance against the destiny of man? Not even these well contrived securities sufficed to save from the uttermost agonies of living inhumation a wretch to these agonies foredoomed. There arrived an epoch, as often before there had arrived, in which I found myself emerging from total unconsciousness into the first feeble and indefinite sense of existence. Slowly, with a tortoise gradation, approached the faint grey dawn of the psychal day, a torpid uneasiness, an apathetic endurance of dull pain. No care, no hope, no effort. Then, after a long interval, a ringing in the ears, Then, after a lapse still longer, a prickling or tingling sensation in the extremities. Then a seemingly eternal period of pleasurable quiescence, during which the awakening feelings are struggling into thought. Then a brief resinking into nonentity. Then a sudden recovery. At length the slight quivering of an eyelid, and immediately thereupon an electric shock of a terror, deadly and indefinite, which sends the blood in torrents from the temples to the heart. And now the first positive effort to think. And now the first endeavour to remember. And now a partial and effervescent success. And now the memory has so far regained its dominion that, in some measure, I am cognizant of my state. I feel that I am not awaking from ordinary sleep. I recollect that I have been subject to catalepsy. And now, at last, as if by the rush of an ocean, my shuddering spirit is overwhelmed by the one grim danger, by the one spectral and ever prevalent idea. For some minutes after this fancy possessed me, I remained without motion. And why? I could not summon courage to move. I dared not make the effort which was to satisfy me of my fate. And yet there was something at my heart which whispered me it was sure. Despair, such as no other species of wretchedness ever calls into being, despair alone urged me, after long irresolution, to uplift the heavy lids of my eyes. I uplifted them. It was dark, all dark. I knew that the fit was over. I knew that the crisis of my disorder had long passed. I knew that I had not fully recovered the use of my visual faculties, and yet it was dark, all dark, the intense and utter raylessness of the night that endureth for evermore. I endeavoured to shriek, and my lips and my parched tongue moved convulsively together in an attempt, but no voice issued from the cavernous lungs, which oppressed, as if by the weight of some incumbent mountain, gasped and palpitated, with the heart, at every elaborate and struggling inspiration. The movements of the jaws, in this effort to cry aloud, showed me that they were bound up, as is usual with the dead. I felt, too, that I lay upon some hard substance, and by something similar my sides were, also, closely compressed. So far I had not ventured to stir any of my limbs, but now I violently threw up my arms, which had been lying at length, with the wrists crossed. They struck a solid wooden substance which extended above my person at an elevation of not more than 6 inches from my face. I could no longer doubt that I reposed within a coffin at last. And now, amid all my infinite miseries, came sweetly the cherub hope. For I thought of my precautions. I writhed and made spasmodic exertions to force open the lid. It would not move. I felt my wrists for the bell rope. It was not to be found. And now the comforter fled for ever, and a still sterner despair reigned triumphant, for I could not help perceiving the absence of the paddings which I had so carefully prepared, and then too came suddenly to my nostrils the strong peculiar odour of moist earth. The conclusion was irresistible. I was not within the vault. I had fallen into a trance while absent from home, while among strangers, when or how I could not remember, and it was they who had buried me as a dog, nailed up in some common coffin, and thrust deep, deep and forever into some ordinary and nameless grave. As this awful conviction forced itself thus into the innermost chambers of my soul, I once again struggled to cry aloud. And in this second endeavour I succeeded. A long, wild, and continuous shriek, or yell of agony, resounded through the realms of the subterranean night. "Hillo, hillo, there!" said a gruff voice in reply. "What the devil's the matter now?" said the second. "Get out o' that," said a third. "What do you mean by yowling in that 'ere kind o' style like a cattymount?" said a fourth, and hereupon I was seized and shaken without ceremony for several minutes by a junto of very rough looking individuals. They did not arouse me from my slumber, for I was wide awake when I screamed, but they restored me to the full possession of my memory. This adventure occurred near Richmond, in Virginia. Accompanied by a friend, I had proceeded upon a gunning expedition some miles down the banks of the James River. Night approached, and we were overtaken by a storm. The cabin of a small sloop lying at anchor in the stream, and laden with garden mould, afforded us the only available shelter. We made the best of it, and passed the night on board. I slept in one of the only 2 berths in the vessel, and the berths of a sloop of 60 or 20 tons need scarcely be described. That which I occupied had no bedding of any kind. Its extreme width was 18 inches, the distance of its bottom from the deck overhead was precisely the same. I found it a matter of exceeding difficulty to squeeze myself in. Nevertheless I slept soundly, and the whole of my vision, for it was no dream and no nightmare, arose naturally from the circumstances of my position, from my ordinary bias of thought, and from the difficulty, to which I have alluded, of collecting my senses, and especially of regaining my memory, for a long time after awaking from slumber. The men who shook me were the crew of the sloop, and some labourers engaged to unload it. From the load itself came the earthly smell. The bandage about the jaws was a silk handkerchief in which I had bound up my head, in default of my customary nightcap. The tortures endured, however, were indubitably quite equal for the time to those of actual sepulchre. They were fearfully, they were inconceivably hideous. But out of evil proceeded good, for their very excess wrought in my spirit an inevitable revulsion. My soul acquired tone, acquired temper. I went abroad, I took vigorous exercise, I breathed the free air of heaven. I thought upon other subjects than death. I discarded my medical books. Buchan I burned. I read no Night Thoughts, no fustian about churchyards, no bugaboo tales, such as this. In short, I became a new man, and lived a man's life. From that memorable night I dismissed for ever my charnel apprehensions, and with them vanished the cataleptic disorder, of which, perhaps, they had been less the consequence than the cause. There are moments when, even to the sober eye of reason, the world of our sad humanity may assume the semblance of a hell. But the imagination of man is no Carathis, to explore with impunity its every cavern. Alas, the grim legion of sepulchral terrors cannot be regarded as altogether fanciful, but like the demons in whose company Afrasiab made his voyage down the Oxus, they must sleep or they will devour us. They must be suffered to slumber, or we perish. End of The Premature Burial by Edgar Allan Poe.
The Scarecrow by G. Ranger Wormser. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Scarecrow. Ben! The woman stood in the doorway of the ramshackle, tumble-down shanty. Her hands were cupped at her mouth. The wind blew loose, whitish blonde wisps of hair around her face, and slashed the faded blue dress into the uncorseted bulk of her body. "Benny? Oh, Benny!" Her call echoed through the still evening. Her eyes, staring straight before her down the slope in front of the house, caught sight of something blue and antiquatedly military standing waist-deep and rigid in the cornfield. "That old Scarecrow," she muttered to herself. "That there old Scarecrow with that there old uniform on to him, too." The sun was going slowly just beyond the farthest hill. The unreal light of the sky's reflected colors held over the yellow, waving tips of the cornfield. "Benny!" she called again. "Oh, Benny!" And then she saw him coming toward her, trudging up the hill. She waited until he stood in front of her. "Supper, Ben," she said. "Was you down in the south meadow where you couldn't hear me call?" No. He was young and slight. He had thick hair and a thin face. His features were small. There was nothing unusual about him. His eyes were deep-set and long, with lids that were heavily fringed. "You heard me calling you?" "Yes, Ma." He stood there straight and still. His eyelids were lowered. "Why ain't you come along, then? What ails you, Benny? Let me shout and shout that way." "Nothing, Ma." "Where was you?" He hesitated a second before answering her. "I was to the bottom of the hill." "And what was you doing down there to the bottom of the hill? What was you doing down there, Benny?" Her voice had a hushed tenseness to it. I was watching, Ma. Watching, Benny? That's what I was doing. His tone held a guarded sullenness. "'Tain't no such a pretty sunset, Benny. Wa'n't watching no sunset. Benny." "Well," he spoke quickly, "what do you want me to put it there for? What'd you want to do that for in the first place?" "There was birds, Benny. You know there was birds." "That ain't what I mean. What for do you put on that there uniform?" "I ain't had nothing else. There wa'n't nothing but your granddad's old uniform. It's fair in rags, Benny. It's all I had to put on to it." "Well, you done it yourself." "Naw, Benny, naw. 'Tain't nothing but an old uniform with a stick into it, just to frighten off them birds. 'Tain't nothing else. Honest, 'tain't, Benny." He looked up at her out of the corners of his eyes. It was waving its arms. "That's the wind." "Naw, Ma, waving its arms before the wind it come up." "Shush, Benny, 'tain't likely, 'tain't. I was watching, Ma, I seen it, wave and wave. Suppose it should beckon to me, I'd be going then, Ma." "Shush, Benny. I'd fair have to go, Ma." "Leave your mammy?" "No, Ben, no. You couldn't never go off and leave your mammy. Even if you ain't able to bear this here farm, you couldn't go off from your mammy. You couldn't. Not your Ma, Benny." She could see his mouth twitch. She saw him catch his lower lip in under his teeth. "Oh, say you couldn't leave, Benny. Say it." I fair hate this here farm," he mumbled. "Morning and night, and morning and night, nothing but chores and earth, and then some more of them chores. And always that there way. So it is, always, and the stillness, nothing alive, nothing. Sometimes I ain't able to stand it nohow. Sometimes you'll get to like it later, maybe." "No, no, Ma." "You will, Benny, sure you will." "I won't never. I ain't able to help fretting. It's all closed up tight inside of me, eatin' and eatin'. It makes me feel sick." She put out a hand and laid it heavily on his shoulder. "Likely it's a touch of fever in the blood, Benny." "Oh, I ain't got no fever." "You'll be feeling better in the morning, Ben." "I'll be feeling the same way, Ma. That's just it, always the same. Nothing but the stillness, nothing alive. And now, there in the cornfield, that ain't alive, Benny." "Ain't it, Ma?" "Don't you say that, Benny, don't." He took her hand off of him. "I was watching," he said doggedly. "I seen it wave and wave." She turned into the house. "That old Scarecrow," she muttered to herself. "That there old Scarecrow." She led the way into the kitchen. The boy followed at her heels. A lamp was lighted on the center table. The one window was uncurtained. Through the naked spot of it the evening glow poured shimmeringly into the room. Inside the doorway they both paused. "You sit down, Benny." He pulled a chair up to the table. She took a steaming pot from the stove and emptying it into a plate, placed the dish before him. He fell to eating silently. She came and sat opposite him. She watched him cautiously. She did not want him to know that she was watching him. Whenever he glanced up, she hurried her eyes away from his face. In the stillness, the only live things were those two pair of eyes darting away from each other. "Benny," she could not stand it any longer. "Benny, just you. He gulped down a mouthful of food. "Oh, Ma, don't you start nothing. Not no more tonight, Ma." She half rose from her chair. For a second she leaned stiffly against the table. Then she slipped back into her seat, her whole body limp and relaxed. "I ain't going to start nothing, Benny. I ain't even going to talk about this here farm. Honest, I ain't. Oh, this here farm. I gave the best years of my life to it." She spoke the words defiantly. "You said that all afore, Ma." "It's true," she murmured. "Terrible true. And I done it for you, Benny. I wanted to be giving you something. It's all I'd got to give you, Benny. There's many a man, Ben, that's glad of his farm, and grateful, too. There's many that makes it pay. And what'll I do if it does pay, Ma? What'll I do then?" I don't know, Benny. It's only just beginning now." "But if it does pay, Ma, what'll I do? Go away from here?" "No, Benny, not away. What'd you go away for, when it pays? After all them years I gave to it?" His spoon clattered noisily to his plate. He pushed his chair back from the table. The legs of it rasped loudly along the uncarpeted floor. He got to his feet. "Let's go on outside," he said. "There ain't no sense to this here talking and talking." She glanced up at him. Her eyes were narrow and hard. "All right, Benny. I'll clear up. I'll be along in a moment. All right, Benny." He slouched heavily out of the room. She sat where she was, the set look pressed on her face. Automatically her hands reached out among the dishes, pulling them toward her. Outside, the boy sank down on the step. It was getting dark. There were shadows along the ground, blue shadows. In the graying skies, one star shone brilliantly. Beyond the mist-slurred summit of a hill, the full moon grew yellow. In front of him was the slope of wind-moved cornfield, and in the center of it the dim military figure standing waist-deep in corn. His eyes fixed themselves to it. Old uniform with a stick into it. He whispered the words very low. Still standing there, still. The same wooden attitude of it, his same cunning watching of it. There was a wind. He knew it was going over his face. He could feel the cool of the wind across his moistened lips. He took a deep breath. Down there in the shivering cornfield, standing in the dark blue shadows, the dim figure had quivered. An arm moved, swaying to and fro. The other arm began swaying, swaying. A tremor ran through it. Once it pivoted. The head shook slowly from side to side. The arms rose and fell and rose again. The head came up and down and rocked a bit to either side. "I'm here," he muttered involuntarily. "Here." The arms were tossing and stretching. He thought the head faced in his direction. The wind had died out. The arms went down and came up and reached. "Benny." The woman seated herself on the step at his side. "Look," he mumbled, "look." He pointed his hand at the dim figure shifting restlessly in the quiet, shadow-saturated cornfield. Her eyes followed after his. "Oh, Benny." "Well," his voice was hoarse, "it's moving, ain't it? You can see it moving for yourself, can't you? You ain't able to say you don't see it, are you?" "The wind," she stammered. "Where's the wind?" "Down there." "Do you feel a wind? Say, do you feel a wind?" "Maybe down there." "Ain't no wind. Not now, there ain't. And it's moving, ain't it? Say it's moving, ain't it?" "It looks like it was dancing, so it does. Like as if it was making itself dance." His eyes were still riveted on those arms that came up and down, and reached. "You'll stop soon now." He stuttered it more to himself than to her. "Then it'll be alive. I've watched it mighty often. Maybe it knows I watch it. Maybe that's why it moves." "Oh, Benny." "Well, you see it, don't you? You thought there was something the matter with me when I come and told you how it waves and waves. But you seen it waving, ain't you?" "It's nothing, Ben. Look, Benny. It stopped." The two of them stared down the slope at the dim, military figure standing rigid and waist-deep in the cornfield. The woman gave a quick sigh of relief. For several moments they were silent. From somewhere in the distance came the harsh, discordant sound of bullfrogs croaking. Out in the night, a dog bayed at the golden full moon climbing up over the hills. A bird circled between sky and earth, hovering above the cornfield. They saw its slow descent, and then for a second they caught the startled whir of its wings as it flew blindly into the night. "That old Scarecrow," she muttered. "Suppose," he whispered, "suppose when it starts its moving like that, suppose someday it walks out of that there cornfield, just naturally walks out, here to me. What then if it walks out? Benny, that's what I'm thinking of all the time. If it takes it into its head to just naturally walk out here, what's going to stop it if it wants to walk out after me, once it starts moving that way? What? Benny, it couldn't do that, it couldn't." "Maybe it won't. Maybe it'll just beckon first. Maybe it won't come after me. Not if I go when it beckons. Kind of figure it'll beckon when it wants me. I couldn't stand the other. Couldn't wait for it to come out here after me. Kind of feel like it'll beckon. When it beckons, I'll be going. Benny, there's sickness coming on you." "'Tain't no sickness." The woman's hands were clenched together in her lap. "I wish to God," she said, "I wish I ain't never seen the day when I put that there thing up that there cornfield. But I ain't thought nothing like this could never happen. I wish to God I ain't never seen the day. 'Tain't got nothing to do with you." His voice was very low. "It's got everything to do with me, so it has. You said that afore yourself, and you was right. Ain't I put it up, and I looked high and low the house through? Ain't that old uniform of your granddad's been the only rag I could lay my hands on? Was there anything else I could use? Was there? Oh, Ma, ain't we needed a scarecrow down there, with them birds so awful bad, pecking away at the corn and pecking? 'Tain't your fault, Ma." There wasn't nothing else but that there old uniform. I wouldn't have took it otherwise. Poor old Paul, so desperate proud of it as he was, him fighting for his country in it, always saying that he was. He couldn't be doing enough for his country, and that there old uniform meant so much to him, like a part of him, I used to think it. And you wanting to say something, Ben? No. He wouldn't even let us be burying him in it. Put my country's flag next to my skin, he told us. When I die, keep the old uniform. Just like a part of him, he thought it. Wouldn't I have kept it, fallen to pieces as it is, if there'd have been anything else to put up there in that there cornfield? She felt the boy stiffen suddenly, and with him a soldier, he broke off abruptly. She sensed what he was about to say. Oh, Benny, that was different. Honest it was. He wasn't the only one in his family. There was 2 brothers. The boy got to his feet. Why won't you let me go? He asked it passionately. Why do you keep me here? You know I ain't happy. You know all the men have gone from these here parts. You know I ain't happy. Ain't you going to see how much I want to go? Ain't you able to know that I want to fight for my country, the way he did his fighting? The boy jerked his head in the direction of the figure, standing waist deep in the cornfield, standing rigidly and faintly outlined beneath the haunting flood of moonlight. Nah, Benny, you can't go, nah. Why, Ma? Why do you keep saying that and saying it? I'm all alone, Benny. I've gave all my best years to make the farm pay for you. You got to stay, Benny. You got to stay on here with me. You just plain got to. You'll be glad someday, Benny. Later on, you'll be right glad. She saw him thrust his hands hastily into his trouser pockets. Glad. His voice sounded tired. I'll be shamed. That's what I'll be. Nothing, do you hear? Nothing but shamed. She started to her feet. Benny. A note of fear shook through the words. You wouldn't go? He waited a moment before he answered. If you ain't wanting me to go, I'll stay. God, I guess I plain got to stay. That's a good boy, Benny. You won't never be sorry now how, I promise you. I'll be making that up to you. Honest, I will. There's lots of ways. He interrupted her. Only, Ma, I won't let it come after me. If it beckons, I got to go. She gave a sudden laugh that trailed off uncertainly. "'Tain't going to beckon, Benny. If it beckons, Ma. 'Tain't going to, Benny. 'Tain't nothing but the wind that moves it. It's just the wind, sure. Maybe you got a touch of fever. Maybe you better go on to bed. You'll be all right in the morning. Just you wait and see. You're a good boy, Benny. You'll never go off and leave your ma on the farm. You're a fine lad, Benny.' If it beckons," he repeated in weary monotone. "'Tain't, Benny. I'll be going to bed," he said. "That's it, Benny. Good night." "Good night, Ma." She stood there listening to his feet thudding up the stairs. She heard him knocking about in the room overhead. A door banged. She stood quite still. There were footsteps moving slowly. A window was thrown open. She looked up to see him leaning far out over the sill. Her eyes went down the slope of the moonlight-bathed cornfield. Her right hand curled itself into a fist. "Oh, Scarecrow," she half laughed. She waited there until she saw the boy draw away from the window. She went into the house and bolted the door behind her. Then she went up the narrow steps. That night she lay awake for a long time. The heat had grown intense. She found herself tossing from side to side of the small bed. The window shade had stuck at the top of the window. The moonlight trickled into the room. She could see the wind-framed, star-specked patches of the skies. When she sat up, she saw the round, reddish-yellow ball of the moon. She must have dozed, because she woke with a start. She felt that she had a fearful, evil dream. The horror of it clung to her. The room was like an oven. She thought the walls were coming together and the ceiling pressing down. Her body was covered with sweat. She forced herself wide awake. She made herself get out of the bed. She stood for a second, uncertain, then she went to the window. Not a breath of air stirring. The moon was high in the sky. She looked out across the hill. Down there to the left, the acres of the potatoes. Potatoes were paying. She counted on a big harvest. To the right, the wheat. Only the second year for those 5 fields. She knew that she had done well with them. She thought with a smile running over her lips back to the time when less than half of the place had been under cultivation. She remembered her dreams of getting the whole of her farm in work. She and the boy had made good. She thought of that with savage complacency. It had been a struggle, a bitter, hard fight from the beginning, but she had made good with her farm. And there down the slope, just in front of the house, the cornfield, and in the center of it, standing waist deep in the corn, the antiquated military figure. The smile slid from her mouth. The suffocating heat was terrific, not a breath of air. Suddenly she began to shake from head to foot. Her eyes, wide and staring, were fixed on the moonlight-whitened cornfield. Her eyes were held to the moonlight-streaked figure standing in the ghostly corn, moving. An arm swayed to and fro, backwards and forwards, backwards. The other arm swaying, a tremor ran through it. Once it pivoted, the head shook slowly from side to side. The arms rose and fell, and rose again. The head came up and down and rocked a bit to either side. "Dancing," she whispered stupidly. "Dancing." She thought she could not breathe. She had never felt such oppressive heat. The arms were tossing and stretching. She could not take her eyes from it. And then she saw both arms reach out. And slowly, very slowly, she saw the hands of them, beckoning. In the silence of the room next to her, she thought she heard a crash. She listened intently, her eyes stuck to those reaching arms, and the hands of them that beckoned and beckoned. "Benny," she murmured, "Benny." Silence. She could not think. It was his talk that had done this, Benny's talk. He had said something about it. Walking out. If it should come out, moving all over like that, if its feet should start, if they should of a sudden begin to shuffle out of the cornfield. But Benny wasn't awake. He couldn't see it. Thank God. If only something would hold it. If only it would stop. God! Nothing stirred out there in the haunting moonlighted night. Nothing moved, nothing but the figure standing waist deep in the cornfield, and even as she looked, the rigid military figure grew still now, but for those slow, beckoning hands. A tremendous dizziness came over her. She closed her eyes for a second, and then she stumbled back to the bed. She lay there panting. She pulled the sheets up across her face, her shaking fingers working the tops of them into a hard ball. She stuffed it between her chattering teeth. Whatever happened, Benny mustn't hear her. She mustn't waken Benny. Thank heaven Benny was asleep. Benny must never know how, out there in the whitened night, the hands of the figure slowly and unceasingly beckoned and beckoned. The sight of those reaching arms stayed before her. When hours later she fell asleep, she still saw the slow-moving, motionless hands. It was morning when she wakened. The sun streamed into the room. She went to the door and opened it. "Benny," she called. "Oh, Benny!" There was no answer. "Benny," she called again. "Get on up. It's late, Benny." The house was quiet. She half-dressed herself and went into his room. The bed had been slept in. She saw that at a glance. His clothes were not there. Down in the field, because she'd forgotten to wake him. In a sudden, stunning flash, she remembered the crash she had heard. It took her a long while to get to the little closet behind the bed. Before she opened it, she knew it would be empty. The door creaked open. His one hat and coat were gone. She had known that. He had seen those two reaching arms. He had seen those two hands that had slowly, very slowly beckoned. She went to the window, her eyes staring straight before her down the slope in front of the house, caught sight of something blue and antiquatedly military standing waist deep and rigid in the cornfield. "You old Scarecrow," she whimpered. "Why are you standing there?" She sobbed. "What are you standing still for now?" End of The Scarecrow by G. Ranger Wormser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by A.E. Hackett. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point you fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it. Oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously, cautiously. I undid it just so much that a single ray fell upon the vulture eye, and this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch, with the thick darkness, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on, steadily, steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief, oh no. It was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot out from the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow of my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the sense? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, and so I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder and louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leapt into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there for many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head, and the arms, and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatsoever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught it all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused, information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure and undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wishing them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and still they chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued, and I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling. But it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, and yet the sound increased. What could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such as a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards. But the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no! No, they heard. They suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark! Louder, 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 louder. Villains, I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. End of Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. Recording by A.E. Hackett, Washington State, USA.
Was It a Dream by Guy de Maupassant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Louise J. Bell. Was It a Dream by Guy de Maupassant. I had loved her madly. Why does one love? Why does one love? How queer it is to see only one being in the world, to have only one thought in one's mind, only one desire in the heart, and only one name on the lips, a name which comes up continually, rising like the water in a spring, from the depths of the soul to the lips, a name which one repeats over and over again, which one whispers ceaselessly, everywhere, like a prayer. I am going to tell you our story, for love only has one, which is always the same. I met her and loved her. That is all. And for a whole year I have lived on her tenderness, on her caresses, in her arms, in her dresses, on her words, so completely wrapped up, bound and absorbed in everything which came from her, that I no longer cared whether it was day or night, or whether I was dead or alive on this old earth of ours. And then she died. How? I do not know. I no longer know anything. But one evening she came home, wet, for it was raining heavily, and the next day she coughed. And she coughed for about a week and took to her bed. What happened I do not remember now, but doctors came, wrote, and went away. Medicines were brought, and some women made her drink them. Her hands were hot, her forehead was burning, and her eyes bright and sad. When I spoke to her, she answered me, but I do not remember what we said. I have forgotten everything, everything, everything. She died, and I very well remember her slight, feeble sigh. The nurse said, "Ah," and I understood. I understood. I knew nothing more, nothing. I saw a priest who said, "Your mistress?" And it seemed to me as if he were insulting her. As she was dead, nobody had the right to say that any longer, and I turned him out. Another came, who was very kind and tender, and I shed tears when he spoke to me about her. They consulted me about the funeral, but I do not remember anything that they said, though I recollected the coffin and the sound of the hammer when they nailed her down in it. Oh God, God! She was buried, buried. She, in that hole. Some people came, female friends. I made my escape and ran away. I ran and then walked through the streets, went home, and the next day started on a journey. Yesterday, I returned to Paris, and when I saw my room again, our room, our bed, our furniture, everything that remains of the life of a human being after death, I was seized by such a violent attack of fresh grief that I felt like opening the window and throwing myself out into the street. I could not remain any longer among these things, between these walls which had enclosed and sheltered her, which retained 1,000 atoms of her skin and of her breath in their imperceptible crevices. I took up my hat to make my escape, and just as I reached the door, I passed the large glass in the hall, which she had put there so that she might look at herself every day from head to foot as she went out, to see if her toilette looked well and was correct and pretty, from her little boots to her bonnet. I stopped short in front of that looking-glass in which she had so often been reflected. So often that it must have retained her reflection. I was standing there, trembling, with my eyes fixed on the glass, on that flat, profound, empty glass, which had contained her entirely, and had possessed her as much as as my passionate looks had. I felt as if I loved that glass. I touched it. It was cold. Oh, the recollection. Sorrowful mirror, burning mirror, horrible mirror to make men suffer such torments. Happy is the man whose heart forgets everything that it has contained, everything that has passed before it, everything that has looked at itself in it, or has been reflected in its affection, in its love. How I suffer. I went out without knowing it, without wishing it, and toward the cemetery. I found her simple grave, a white marble cross, with these few words: she loved, was loved, and died. She is there, below, decayed. How horrible! I sobbed with my forehead on the ground, and I stopped there for a long time, a long time. Then I saw that it was getting dark, and a strange, mad wish, the wish of a despairing lover, seized me. I wished to pass the night, the last night, in weeping on her grave. But I should be seen and driven out. How was I to manage? I was cunning, and got up and began to roam about in that city of the dead. I walked and walked. How small this city is in comparison with the other, the city in which we live. And yet, how much more numerous the dead are than the living. We want high houses, wide streets, and much room for the 4 generations who see the daylight at the same time, drink water from the spring, and wine from the vines, and eat bread from the plains. And for all the generations of the dead, for all that ladder of humanity that has descended down to us, there is scarcely anything. Scarcely anything. The earth takes them back, and oblivion effaces them. Adieu. At the end of the cemetery, I suddenly perceived that I was in its oldest part, where those who had been dead a long time are mingling with the soil, where the crosses themselves are decayed, where, possibly, newcomers will be put tomorrow. It is full of untended roses, of strong and dark cypress trees, a sad and beautiful garden, nourished on human flesh. I was alone, perfectly alone. So I crouched in a green tree and hid myself there completely amid the thick and somber branches. I waited, clinging to the stem, like a shipwrecked man does to a plank. When it was quite dark, I left my refuge and began to walk, softly, slowly, inaudibly, through that ground full of dead people. I wandered about for a long time, but could not find her tomb again. I went on with extended arms, knocking against the tombs with my hands, my feet, my knees, my chest, even with my head, without being able to find her. I groped about like a blind man finding his way. I felt the stones, the crosses, the iron railings, the metal wreaths, and the wreaths of faded flowers. I read the names with my fingers by passing them over the letters. What a night! What a night! I could not find her again. There was no moon. What a night! I was frightened, horribly frightened in these narrow paths between 2 rows of graves. Graves, 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 nothing but graves. On my right, on my left, in front of me, around me, everywhere there were graves. I sat down on one of them, for I could not walk any longer. My knees were so weak. I could hear my heart beat. And I heard something else as well. What? A confused, nameless noise. Was the noise in my head? In the impenetrable night? Or beneath the mysterious earth, the earth sown with human corpses? I looked all round me, but I cannot say how long I remained there. I was paralyzed with terror, cold with fright, ready to shout out, ready to die. Suddenly, it seemed to me that the slab of marble on which I was sitting was moving. Certainly it was moving, as if it were being raised. With a bound I sprang on to the neighboring tomb, and I saw, yes, I distinctly saw the stone which I had just quitted rise upright. Then the dead person appeared, a naked skeleton, pushing the stone back with its bent back. I saw it quite clearly, although the night was so dark. On the cross I could read, "Here lies Jacques Olivant, who died at the age of 51. He loved his family, was kind and honorable, and died in the grace of the Lord." The dead man also read what was inscribed on his tombstone. Then he picked up a stone off the path, a little pointed stone, and began to scrape the letters carefully. He slowly effaced them, and with the hollows of his eyes, he looked at the places where they had been engraved. Then, with the tip of the bone that had been his forefinger, he wrote in luminous letters, like those lines which boys trace on walls with the tip of a lucifer match, "Here reposes Jacques Olivant, who died at the age of 51. He hastened his father's death by his unkindness, as he wished to inherit his fortune. He tortured his wife, tormented his children, deceived his neighbors, robbed everyone he could, and died wretched." When he had finished writing, the dead man stood motionless, looking at his work. On turning round, I saw that all the graves were open, that all the dead bodies had emerged from them, and that all had effaced the lies inscribed on the gravestones by their relations, substituting the truth instead. And I saw that all had been the tormentors of their neighbors, malicious, dishonest, hypocrites, liars, rogues, calumniators, envious, that they had stolen, deceived, performed every disgraceful, every abominable action. These good fathers, these faithful wives, these devoted sons, these chaste daughters, these honest tradesmen, these men and women who were called irreproachable. They were all writing at the same time, on the threshold of their eternal abode, the truth, the terrible and the holy truth of which everybody was ignorant, or pretended to be ignorant, while they were alive. I thought that she also must have written something on her tombstone, and now, running without any fear among the half-open coffins, among the corpses and skeletons, I went toward her, sure that I should find her immediately. I recognized her at once, without seeing her face, which was covered by the winding sheet, and on the marble cross, where shortly before I had read, "She loved, was loved, and died," I now saw, having gone out in the rain one day, in order to deceive her lover, she caught cold and died. It appears that they found me at daybreak, lying on the grave, unconscious. End of Was It a Dream? Recording by Louise J. Bell. Sebastopol, California.